So with that, let's go ahead and get started with Rule 1. And with Rule 1, we just had one definition to go over at the start, and it's not exactly the most complicated one, and that is general penalty. Definition found on page 205, which is the same as it's been before, is the general penalties, loss of hole in match play, or two strokes in stroke play. But we'll use this phrase much more in the 2019 rules because the rules themselves use it more, where instead of having a penalty statement where it'll say loss of hole or in match play or two strokes in stroke play, it'll be more simplified and just say penalty is the general penalty. And that is what that means. So now with Rule 1 itself, and first we'll notice right away a change in the format, and I think a very good and useful change. That each rule now opens with a purpose statement, so that gives us insight as to the philosophy, into one, the philosophy of what that rule is trying to accomplish, and then two, how that rule intends to accomplish that. And there are many more philosophical statements and principles expressed in these rules than before. And that's very helpful with the rules because it helps us understand what each rule is, that helps us understand a rule better when we know what that rule is trying to accomplish. And with that. So for example, with Rule 1 here, the purpose statement starts out with it and introduces these key principles, which we've heard people generalize before, but they weren't explicitly stated in the rules themselves. That is, play the course as you find it and play the ball as it lies. And when you think about it, so many of the rules revolve around just those two principles. Also talk about playing by the rules and in the spirit of the game, something that again was not explicitly stated, and also expressed the statement that the player is responsible for applying the zone penalties. All right, so with that, Rule 1.1, notice that a change in format. Previously we used 1-1, but now it's 1.1 for the numbering. No changes in content here. Still, golf is played in a round of 18 or fewer holes by striking a ball with the club. Each hole starts with a stroke from the teeing area and ends when the ball is holed. And then here we have those principles mentioned in the purpose statement. For each stroke, the player must play the course as he or she finds it and must play the ball as it lies. But as we'll see, there are some exceptions that allow the player either to alter the conditions or to have the player play from somewhere else, such as, say, if the ball's on a cart path. All right, Rule 1.2, standards of player conduct. Now, one thing you'll notice is that with the new rules, there's no longer an etiquette section as there was in the previous book. And then much of the information that was in the old etiquette section is now embedded in the rules themselves, in part just to strengthen that itself, to be able to tell players, hey, look, it's in the rules themselves that you're expected to take good care of the course, and things like that. So it puts it more front and center. 1.2a, conduct expected of all players. And expected is a strong word, and that lets players know what is expected of them. And one thing to keep in mind with the rules is that the rules are for everyone, for whether it's people who've been officiating for years and years, for players, but also newcomers to the game. So imagine if you are a new golfer and saying, I'm going to take up golf in 2019, let's see what the rules are. And right away it tells you, geez, this is what's expected of me. That sends a pretty strong message from the start, which is a very positive thing. All players are expected to play in the spirit of the game by acting with integrity, for example, by following the rules, applying penalties, and being honest, by showing consideration to other players, for example, not distracting others, by taking good care of the course, replacing divots, raking bunkers, and so forth. So, but there is no penalty under the rules for failing to act in this way, except the committee has the authority to disqualify your player for acting contrary to the spirit of the game if it finds that the player has committed serious misconduct. So not a new principle, and there is an interpretation 1.2a/1 that goes over examples of acts that would and would not constitute serious misconduct. And one of the key points, one of the key messages is that in many cases, before a player reaches the point of disqualification, it makes sense to warn the player to say, look, this is not acceptable. If you continue to do this, you'll be disqualified. But certainly there can be one-off situations where a single act would warrant disqualification. So if a player acts bad enough, he can be disqualified. But then we go on to say penalties other than disqualification may be imposed for player misconduct only if those penalties are adopted as part of a code of conduct. So if the committee has not adopted a code of conduct, then it's all or nothing in terms of penalty, either no penalty or disqualification. But this ability for a committee to adopt a code of conduct is new for 2019 and is up to each committee to decide if it's going to adopt a code of conduct, and if so, what it will address. Will it address dress code? Will it address language, other behavioral points? And then that code of conduct itself could apply other penalties, such as a one-stroke penalty for doing this, or a two-stroke penalty, for, potentially building up to the penalty of disqualification. And that's what this next section, 1.2b, talks about. And then you see in blue the reference to committee procedures, which is that section in the big book, the official guide, that goes into that in some detail. So, but for the purposes of this, all we need to know is the committee now has the authority to establish a code of conduct and to apply penalties under it. All right, rule 1.3, playing by the rules. First, we start out by what does the term rules means? Well, it's the 24 rules and definitions and any local rules. And players are also responsible for complying with the terms of the competition. Now, notice with this, what is not included in the meaning of rules? Interpretations. And that's very interesting, and I think we should all take comfort from that, because what that means is that the interpretations really are just that. They are interpretations, and there aren't actually, it's not a backhanded way or sneaky way to write rules. That as you spend time in the official guide and going through the interpretations, you realize that the great majority of interpretations really just provide examples of certain rules. So that's just an interesting point to note.
John, question?
Yeah, Dan.
What happens if the interpretation appears to contradict the rule directly? Do we follow the rule?
What happens if an interpretation appears to contradict the rule? Well, I think if it covers a specific situation, then I think we're obligated to apply the interpretation. All right, 1.3b, applying the rules. The player is responsible for applying the rules. Players are expected, there's that word again, are expected to recognize when they've breached a rule and to be honest in applying their own penalties. So in other words, ignorance of the rules is not an excuse. You go on to say if a player knows that he or she has breached a rule that involves a penalty and deliberately fails to apply the penalty, the player is disqualified. And note that is in both match play and stroke play with no qualification. And another point just to be aware of is we'll see the word deliberately often in the rules, and that is what previously we would have where previously the word intentionally was used, now the word deliberately is used. So just something to be mindful of. Then the second part, if two or more players deliberately agree to ignore any rule or a penalty they know applies, and any of those players have started the round, they are disqualified, even if they've not yet acted on the agreement. So this is just as before, that if two players The key points here is that this provision applies if the players know that they're not allowed to do what they're agreeing to do. That if, let's say, if Arnold and I are playing and we agree in stroke play that we don't have to putt out inside a putter length of the hole. And Arnold says, I know we're not allowed to do that, but let's go ahead and do that anyway to help with pace of play, and it'll probably help with our score also. And then once one of us tees off during the round, we are disqualified. Even if, say, we have this discussion on the first screen, and then we're playing with Dan, and Dan says, hey guys, you can't do that. That's it's too late. That even though we have not yet acted on that agreement, we would be disqualified in that case. And the key here is that we knew that what we were agreeing to do was not allowed by the rules. We'll see that that's different than if Arnold and I agree to do something out of ignorance of the rules, where let's say Arnold's ball's on a cart path and we're not quite sure of the relief procedure, but we agree that it makes sense for him to be able to drop on the right side, which turns out to be in a wrong place, and he drops and plays. Arnold has played from a wrong place, and in stroke play would be subject to penalty for playing from a wrong place, but he and I did not deliberately agree to ignore the rules because we thought what we were doing was correct at the time. All right. Next point, when it's necessary to decide questions of fact, such as where did a ball last cross the edge of a penalty area? A player is responsible for considering not only his own knowledge of the facts, but also all other information that's reasonably available. So in other words, if I hit my ball towards a red penalty area, what we formerly thought of as a lateral water hazard, and I say in my own mind, I know for sure the ball crossed right here, but then there are, several other people, whether perhaps at the spot, maybe spectators or a caddy up there. And if I either disregard their information or choose not to ask when in fact their information would have been very useful, then I'm on the hook if I proceed incorrectly. A player may ask for help with the rules from a referee or the committee, but if help's not available, the player must play on and raise the question later. And we'll see under Rule 20 what a player can do in match play and what a player can do in stroke play if he or she's not sure what to do. All right, Rule 1.32, accepting the player's reasonable judgment in determining the location when applying the rules. This is a new and important section in the rules. It hints at several parts that previously have been embedded in decisions, but now it formally puts them in the rules. Many rules require a player to determine a spot, point, line, area, or other location, such as where the ball last crossed the edge of a penalty area, estimating or measuring when dropping a ball when taking relief, or replacing a ball on its original spot. Now, does that sound familiar to anyone? Yeah, the Lexi Thompson situation, right, out in Palm Springs. Now, such determinations need to be made promptly and with care, but due to their very nature, can't be precise. That there's really no way to know exactly where a ball that's 30 feet off the ground, crossed the edge of the penalty area. All you can do is gather what information you reasonably can and make your best judgment based on that information. So long as the player does what can be reasonably expected under the circumstances to make an accurate determination, the player's reasonable judgment will be accepted even if after the stroke the determination is shown to be wrong by video or other information. However, if the player becomes aware of a wrong determination before the stroke is made, it must be corrected. So, for example, the player uses what would be considered reasonable judgment to estimate where his ball crossed the edge of a penalty area, and drops the ball based on that reasonable judgment. Before he plays, though, he becomes aware that his reasonable judgment was wrong. Then what this says is there's no penalty, and since he hasn't played yet, he would correct that mistake by using what would in fact be the correct point of where the ball last crossed the edge of the penalty area. So a useful and important point is now part of the rules. All right, 1.3c, penalties. A penalty applies when a breach of a rule results from the player's own actions or the actions of his or her caddy. So nothing new there. And then we have a couple of interesting additions to that. A penalty also applies when another person takes an action that would breach the rules if taken by the player or caddy, and that person does so at the player's request or while acting with the player's authority. So let's say the player and his caddy are standing behind a tree, surveying a shot towards the green, and the player asks a spectator or marshal, hey, would you please hold that tree branch back that's 10 yards in front of me? Well, certainly if the player or caddy himself were to do that, it would be a breach of the rules. So it makes sense that if this person were to do so at the player's request, for the player likewise to be penalized. Now, the second variation of that is if the player sees another person about to take an action concerning the player's ball or equipment that he or she knows would breach the rules if taken by the player or caddy and does not take reasonable steps to object or stop it from happening. So let's say if the player sees a spectator about to bend a branch back that's over his ball, the player just can't say, oh, well, gee, this is my lucky day. I'm not penalized because I didn't ask this person to do it. But if the player is in a position to stop that, then the player needs to stop it. The player can't take advantage of that. So that was a point that previously was in a decision. Levels of penalties, which it's nice that now the 3 different types of penalties are spelled out here, with a little bit of insight as to when each applies. One-stroke penalty. This penalty applies in both match play and stroke play under certain rules where either A, the potential advantage from a breach is minor, or B, a player takes penalty relief by playing a ball from a different place. For example, a player treats his ball as being unplayable in a bush and takes unplayable relief. The general penalty, which we saw as loss of hole in match play or 2 strokes in stroke play, applies for a breach of most rules where the potential advantage is more significant than where only 1 penalty stroke would apply. And then disqualification, which can apply in both match play and stroke play for breaching certain rules involving serious misconduct or where the potential advantage is too significant for the player's score to be considered valid. So, as is the case with many things, including the legal world, there are several reasons for imposing penalties. One is to deter people from breaching a rule or breaching a law, and the second is to penalize people to try to equalize things between them and those who didn't breach the rules. And with disqualification, there can be certain breaches where you simply can't quantify how much of an advantage a player may have gained. And for example, if a player uses a non-conforming golf ball that goes 50 yards farther off the tee, how do you quantify what kind of advantage he is gaining by using that? You really can't. So that's why the penalty for use of that ball would have to be disqualification. All right, no discretion to vary penalties. Penalties need to be applied as provided in the rules. Neither a player nor the committee has authority to apply penalties in a different way. So the committee can't say, well, the rules say this is a loss of hole penalty, but that seems a little harsh in the circumstances that we're just going to make it a 1-stroke penalty. You can't do that. And also, a wrong application of a penalty or failure to apply a penalty may stand only if it is too late to correct it. So then we'll see under Rule 20 that we go into some detail as to how a committee can go about correcting wrong rulings. Because as we all know, wrong rulings are a fact of life, and it's very good to see the rules providing guidance on how to deal with wrong rulings, because that's something that every one of us in this room has had to deal with before. And then interesting final sentence that we touched on the previous page. In match play, the player and opponent may agree how to decide a rules issue so long as they do not deliberately agree to apply the rules in the wrong way. So keys here is that it's match play and that the players are not deliberately ignoring a rule. They simply don't know what to do. They say, well, this seems reasonable. And I turn to Phil and say, Phil, how about if I'm not quite sure where I'm supposed to drop in this case, how about if I drop over here to the left? And he says, I don't know either, but that seems fair. So go ahead. Then in that case, if it's match play, then there's going to be no penalty. Now, what if in that case I drop it over and play on the left, and then Phil has second thoughts? He says, John, I'm not sure you're allowed to do that. Can Phil then raise that issue? Say, John, I think you played from the wrong place and get a penalty. Answer is, by necessity, no, because that once Phil agrees to a certain procedure and I do it, then he has to live with it.
How about before you play your shot? If I disagree, then you can.
Yeah, I think if before you, let's say I drop in a wrong place, and then you pull out your local rule sheet and you say, oh, John, no, actually this is covered. That's wrong. Then yes, then I could correct the mistake in that case. All right, now next section, which you all remember was previously, it was a very long, complicated decision. And now it's a long, somewhat complicated section of the rules. But the important thing is that the rules themselves now cover this situation that comes up more often than we might think, and provide and breaks it down into key criteria. If a player breaches multiple rules or breaches the same rule multiple times before an intervening event happens, and by intervening event, it could be a player making a stroke or becoming aware of the breach, the penalty that applies depends on what the player did. So first section, when the breaches resulted from unrelated acts, then the player will get a separate penalty for each breach. So let's say, the player does two things before he plays that have nothing to do with each other. Let's say, I'm in tall grass and I push the grass down around my ball, and then I ask Phil whether he thinks I should hit a wedge, just hack a wedge back to the fairway, or if he thinks I can get a 7-iron out of that lie. I ask him for advice. So I breached two different rules. And in that case, were the two breaches related in any way to each other? They really were not. So in that case, I'd wind up with total 4 in stroke play, 4 penalty strokes. In match play, it's usually not that big of a deal because either one of those breaches involves a loss of hole penalty, so it'd be loss of hole. But in stroke play, I'd wind up with 4 penalty strokes because of the unrelated acts. A similar situation, and going back to what the first part talks about with an intervening event. Let's say, my ball is under a tree and I break a tree branch to improve, let's say, the area of intended swing. And then I play, but I still whiff the ball. So then I decide to break off more of that tree branch. So in stroke play, what would be the situation then? In that case, I'd have 4 penalty strokes is the key. Even though what I did were similar physical acts, I had an intervening act, the stroke made. And one way to think of it is when the intervening event occurs, the penalty clock resets and you start again. So in that case, it'd be 4 penalty strokes. All right, now what to do when breaches result from a single act or from related acts? Well, the player gets 1 penalty, but If the act or acts breached multiple rules involving different penalties, the higher level penalty applies. And we'll go through some examples, but what that latter part means about different penalties, and again, the higher level penalty is, let's say a player does two things wrong. Let's say he moves his ball, and let's say in a situation where there is a penalty for it. And normally there'd be a one-stroke penalty, and what's he required to do? Replace the ball. But instead, he doesn't replace the ball, and he plays the ball from its new location. So you could say, well, normally, well, what to do? One-stroke penalty or a two-stroke penalty? You know, this says he gets a single penalty. Well, he gets the higher penalty. He gets the two-stroke penalty. So if you have a situation where you have a one player through related acts has a one-stroke penalty and two-stroke penalty, this just means that he's going to get the two-stroke penalty. So let's go through these three sections. Multiple procedural breaches. If a player's single act or related acts breach more than one of the procedural requirements for marking, lifting, cleaning, dropping, placing, or replacing a ball, where the penalty is one stroke, such as both lifting the ball without marking its spot and cleaning the lifted ball when not allowed, the player gets one penalty stroke in total. Now, one point to notice that we'll see as we go through these rules, a very nice addition is the rules actually now include examples. That previously the rules just were the rules, but now they have examples just to help us understand the point. And that's a great example here, is to read that section without that example, it's all intimidating, where it will leave us, could leave us scratching our heads saying, well, what exactly does that mean? But that example makes it very clear. Second category, playing an incorrectly substituted ball from a wrong place. In stroke play, if a player plays a substituted ball when not allowed and also plays that ball from a wrong place, it's going to get a total penalty of 2 strokes. So just as before. So he's done 2 things, but it's the same, each breach has the same penalty. Just in the first section, multiple procedural breaches, each breach carried the same penalty of 1 stroke. Now in the third section, we're going to have different penalties. If a player's single act or related acts breach one or more procedural requirements where the penalty is 1 stroke, and also breach one or both of the rules against playing an incorrectly substituted ball and playing from a wrong place, player gets 2 penalty strokes in total. So he's done one thing that warrants a 1-stroke penalty, but then in a related act, something else that involves a 2-stroke penalty, he's going to get what the rules call the higher level penalty, the 2 penalty strokes. And then one useful point that a nice addition to the rules, just to state it explicitly, is that any penalty strokes the player gets for taking relief, such as from a penalty area, always apply in addition to any other penalties. So for example, if a player is taking relief from a penalty area, drops and plays from a wrong place, in stroke play, his total penalty will be what? It will be 3 strokes. 1 penalty stroke for taking relief, and then 2 more for playing from a wrong place. So that's rule 1, basic information regarding relating to the game. Any questions on that? Yes.
The little arrows, there's 3 of them below the second bullet. Now those arrows apply just to the second bullet. Is that correct?
Oh yes. That's a good point. And I'm not quite sure what the term is for those arrows. Does anyone? we know bullet points, but I'm not quite sure. Maybe we just call them arrows. But I'm sorry. Just so the other people who didn't hear a good question and ask, that those 3 arrows apply just to the second bullet point.
So then a follow-up question to that. You gave good examples for the first bullet point, good examples. Now, would there be examples like that in the big book that I don't, if we're calling this the
Yeah. In the big book, the official guide, there will be examples of many of these points. But the point I was making is it doesn't apply everywhere, but in many cases, there are in the rules themselves some examples given, where in the previous rules that was not the case. So with the first bullet point, there just was not an example given. But I think there are some examples and interpretations of that.
6 of
Oh,
them. 6 sections.
okay.
John, I have a
Yeah,
question.
yeah, Dan.
Do you have some rule of thumb on how do we remember what is a related act as opposed to an unrelated act?
How to remember what's a related act or an unrelated act. And I think I think one of the key points, or one of the big points in terms of what's related, unrelated, is when there's been an intervening act, then there's an interpretation that says that breaks that relationship. So anytime there's an intervening act, then the acts are going to be unrelated. Otherwise, in terms of a rule of thumb, I think the best we can do is go through the examples given and interpretations to get a feel for that. But in terms of what a precise definition, I'm afraid I don't have one.
The answer is no.
No.
There's no
Yes.
way.
No.
But a swing is always an intervention.
Yes.
Yes, the stroke is always.
Yeah. All right. With Rule 2, we'll start. Rule 2 covers the course, and we'll look at a number of definitions before we get into the rule itself, some of which are new. First definition we'll look at is areas of the course, which succinctly lists the 5 different areas of the course. And that is the general area, which we previously thought of as through the green, the teen area of the hole being played, penalty areas, what we previously thought of as water hazards, bunkers, and then the putting green of the hole being played. Second definition is course. The entire area of play within the edge of any boundary set by the committee. All areas inside the boundary edge are in bounds and part of the course. All areas outside the boundary edge are out of bounds and therefore not part of the course. The boundary edge extends both up and down. And a reminder, what we just saw, the course is made up of 5 defined areas. General area. Again, what we previously considered through the green, the area of the course that covers all of the course except for the 4 defined areas, meaning teeing ground, penalty areas, bunkers, and putting green of the hole being played. The general area includes all teen locations on the course other than the specific teen area that you're playing from. And that, why is that important? Well, sometimes we hit wild tee shots that come to rest on other tees. And this just reminds us that that the ball lies in the general area. And a couple of new terms, boundary object. Artificial object defining or showing out of bounds, such as walls, fences, stakes, and railings. And very nicely, it explicitly states from which free relief is not allowed. This includes any base and post of a boundary fence, does not include angled supports or steps, bridge, or similar constructions for getting over the wall or fence. And boundary objects are treated as immovable, even if they are movable or any part of them is movable. So, for example, let's say there's a stone wall that the committee has said that the inside face of it defines out of bounds, that by saying that as a boundary object, it's immovable, the player cannot go up and start dismantling that stone wall, for example, if it's on his line of play. And then last definition for this section is integral object. On page 208, an integral object, which a new definition is an artificial object defined by the committee as part of the challenge of playing the course from which free relief is not allowed. So, most common example of that, or the best known example, is the road behind the 17th green at the old course at St. Andrews, just with the thinking being that that's part of the challenge of the hole and is a factor in player determining how aggressive to be with the approach shot. Integral objects are treated as being immovable, but if part of an integral object such as a gate or door, meets the definition of a movable obstruction, that part is treated as a movable obstruction. So let's say there's a fence, it's not a boundary fence, and the committee has said the whole fence is an integral object, but the gate is unlocked, that the player could treat that gate as movable obstruction, which means, among other things, the player could move that. All right, now for the rule itself. Purpose of the rule introduces the basic things every player should know about the course, the 5 defined areas, and several types of defined objects that can interfere with play. Now, why is it important to know this? Well, because knowing on what part of the course the ball lies and the status of an interfering object can affect the player's options for playing the ball or taking relief. So that's why it's important to know all this. Rule 2.1, course boundaries and out of bounds. Golf is played on a course whose boundaries are set by the committee. Areas not on the course are out of bounds. So the main takeaway from this is nothing is automatically out of bounds. It's only out of bounds if the committee says it's out of bounds. So the committee does have a role to play there. 2.2 talks about the 5 areas of the course, which we largely covered in definitions. The general area, and it even goes on to explain why it's called the general area, because it covers most of the course, and is where a player's ball will most often be played from. 2.2b, the 4 specific areas: teen area, penalty areas, bunkers through the green. And look above this. This is one of the really nice additions to the rules. Is the rules themselves now have diagrams. That previously the decisions book had a few diagrams, but now the rules have these diagrams, and they're very nice color diagrams and simple to understand. So this talks about that. We can see where the teen ground is, where the what bunkers are, what penalty areas are. 2 different types. One, a pond up near the green, the other off to the left, and the putting green. So we'll see, especially under the relief rules, more diagrams that go a long way towards helping understanding. Now, determining the area of the course where the ball lies, a nice addition to the rules. The area of the course where a player's ball lies affects the rules that apply both to playing that ball and in taking relief. So it's important to know on which part of the course the ball lies. Now, a ball is always treated as lying in only one area of the course. And nicely, they took some information that was in a decision and now have put it in the rules themselves. Now, if part of the ball is both in the general area and one of the 4 specific areas, then it's treated as lying in that specific area of the course. So, for example, if the ball is half on the penalty area line and half in the general area, where is that ball considered to be? In the penalty area. And then the second bullet point, if part of the ball is in 2 specific areas of the course, it is treated as lying in the specific area that comes first in this order: penalty area, bunker, and putting green. So one way to look at it is the player is going to get the more severe situation. So sometimes we see, for example, the so-called beach bunkers, where a bunker just goes right into a pond. You'll see a penalty area line painted through the sand, that if part of the ball is in the bunker and part of it's on the penalty area line, then where does that ball lie? In this case, that second bullet point will say the ball's in the penalty area. All right, rule 2.3. Objects or conditions that can interfere with play. Certain rules may give free relief from interference by certain objects or conditions, such as loose impediments, movable obstructions, and abnormal course conditions. And we won't go over those definitions here, because we'll cover those in those specific rules themselves, where with better context. But a reminder that there's no free relief from boundary objects or integral objects that interfere with play. All right, Rule 2.4, a new term, but not necessarily a new concept. No play zones. A no play zone is defined as a defined part of an abnormal course condition. So previously, what we would call ground under repair, from which play is prohibited. So it could be a decorative flower bed, it could be environmentally sensitive area, or a penalty area, such as environmentally sensitive wetland, where play is not allowed. A player must take relief if his or her ball is in the no play zone, or if the ball is outside the no play zone, but the no play zone interferes with the area of intended stance or swing. And a nice reference to Section 5H of the committee procedures, reminding that a code of conduct may tell players to stay out of a no play zone entirely. If, for example, the committee is concerned for safety purposes, that let's say there's a fragile cliff and players, and for legal and safety reasons, the committee simply doesn't want players going anywhere near this area, they could prohibit them from simply entering it as well. So that's Rule 2, talking about various parts of the course, and a lot of this we'll go into in detail when we review those, when we take a look at those relief procedures. Any questions on that? All right. If not, we'll go ahead and jump into Rule 3, which is a more involved rule. And we'll look at a handful of definitions to start with. First, let's look at marker. The marker first applies only in stroke play. There's no marker in match play. Is the person responsible for entering the player's score on the player's scorecard and for certifying that scorecard. We'll see later in this rule why we use the word certifying now instead of signing. The marker may be another player, but may not be a partner for obvious conflict of interest reasons. The committee may identify who will be the player's marker or tell the players how to choose a marker. Match play. A form of play where a player or side plays directly against an opponent or opposing side in a head-to-head match of one or more rounds. For example, you could have a 36-hole match consisting of 2 rounds. A player or side wins a hole by completing the hole in fewer strokes, and the match is won when a player leads the other side by more holes than remaining to be played. And there can be several forms of match play. You can have singles match play, a 3-ball match, foursomes match, or a 4-ball match. And we'll get into this in our last session a little bit more. Now let's look at definition of opponent. Person a player competes against in a match. This applies only in match play. Scorecard, a new definition for this year. And note, and what's another change about this? Scorecard's now one word. So very big change. So
Thank the UN for that.
yes. So now the golf world will spell scorecard the same way the rest of the world intuitively would. In fact, I think the golf world was already spelling as one word, just the rules of golf are spelling as 2 words. Document where a player's score for each hole is entered in stroke play. And it could be in paper, or haven't seen this yet, or an electronic form approved by the committee that allows the score to be entered for each hole, handicap to be entered, and to allow somehow for the marker and the player to certify the scores. So if it's in an electronic format, it might not necessarily involve signing. It might involve checking a box or something like that. Now, a scorecard is not required in match play and may be used by the players to help keep the match score. So with that, if for convenience 2 players playing a match and let's say one of them keeps a scorecard, Does that scorecard carry any official significance? No, it does not. It's just a convenience for them without any official meaning. And then last definition for this section is stroke play. A form of play where a player or side competes against all other players or sides in the competition. So match play was head-to-head, and stroke play you're playing against people that might not even be on the golf courses at that same time. The score for a round is the total number of strokes, including any penalty strokes, taken to hole out on each hole. And the winner is the player who completes all rounds in the fewest total strokes. Other forms of stroke play with different scoring methods are Stableford, then a new format for this year called maximum score in par and bogey. And in stroke play, there can be different formats such as individual competitions or foursomes and four-ball. And one thing to note with the rules is that rules 1 through 19, or perhaps 1 through 20, are really written with just individual play in mind. That, you know, there's certain things that we can extrapolate from them about what to do if this happens in four-ball play or in foursome play, but for ease of use, they're really written with just individual play in mind. As if each of these rules was cluttered up with or partner or partner's caddy, that tends to make things just more cumbersome, and it can take away from the clarity as well. All right, rule 3, competition. Purpose, with 3 central elements of all golf competitions, whether it's match play or stroke play, whether it's an individual format or partnership format, and then whether it's a gross competition or net competition. Those are 3 basic issues for each competition to settle before it can begin. All right, 3.1a, form of play, match play or stroke play. Well, first, we acknowledge that these are very different forms of play. In match play, player and opponent compete against each other based on holes won, lost, or tied. In stroke play, all players compete with one another based on total score. That is, adding up each player's total number of strokes on each hole in all rounds. Most of the rules apply in both forms of play, but certain rules apply only in one or the other. And we'll see this later in rules 21 through 23 with variations of that. All right, how players compete. Playing as an individual or as partners. Golf's played by individual players competing on their own or by partners competing together as a side. While rules 1 through 20 focus on individual play, they also apply in competitions involving partners and in team competitions. How 3.1c, how players score. In a scratch competition, the player's gross score for a hole is his or her total number of strokes, and without reference to any handicap stroke, any handicap. Whereas in a handicap competition, the gross score is adjusted for the player's handicap strokes. And then, you know, we actually state in here very nicely, again, look at this from the eyes of someone new to the game, saying, well, why do you have both forms of competition? Well, it says so right here. This is done so players of differing abilities can compete in a fair way, which, you know, as we know, is one of the great benefits of golf, how you can have players of very different abilities able to play a match against each other. All right, now 3.2, dealing with match play. Purpose of the rule with match play has specific rules.
Question,
Oh, yes, sorry, Kim.
back to 3.1.
Mhm.
In the old rules,
Okay.
in the olden days, it used to say in the rules, I think, that the stroke play and match play could not be played in the same event.
Oh, Ken, you're exactly right. Previously, it was not allowed for match play and stroke play to be played concurrently. So for you and me to go out, play match against each other while we're also playing in a qualifier for the club championship, that we couldn't do that. But now that is possible. In fact, if you see on the previous page there's a reference to section 6C in the committee procedures for considerations for the committee if it runs a competition that combines the two forms of play, saying that, look, this is not ideal, but if you do it, here's how you should do it in effect. So it acknowledges that it can happen, and some of the pitfalls, but also give some guidance. So as you point out, Ken, that is a change. All right, 3.2 with match play. Again, it establishes some key parts that we've often taken for granted for match play, but explicitly states them, that it emphasizes the head-to-head nature of match play. The players compete solely against each other on every hole. They can see each other's play and therefore can protect their own interests. So that's why, for example, that you can't have players, they're not playing together, have a match against each other. That, because, if Phil and I are playing a match, how Phil plays his tee shot, that might well affect how I play my tee shot. And then I want to be able to keep an eye on him. He wants to be able to keep an eye on me. So it emphasizes the head-to-head nature. And then it also, it provides some background as to why certain things in match play are the way they are, because only Phil and I are involved in that case. Where let's say everyone in this room, we're having a stroke play tournament, that we could not, everyone's not playing together, so we couldn't, for example, agree on whether Dan's 18-inch putt should be conceded. So that's why in stroke play, Dan has to hole out. But if just Dan and I were playing a match, I could concede that, because it's just only Dan and I are involved. So some of the key differences there, which in turn explains why some of the rules, especially in match play, are the way they are. All right, 3.2a, winning a hole. Player wins a hole when he completes the hole in fewer strokes than the opponent. The opponent concedes the hole, or the opponent gets a loss of hole penalty. Now, an interesting addition after this, and we'll read through it, and then we might scratch our heads, but then we'll look at an example. If the opponent's ball in motion needs to be holed to tie the hole, and the ball is deliberately deflected or stopped by any person at a time when there is no reasonable chance it can be holed, such as when the ball is rolled past the hole and will not roll back, the result of the hole has been decided and the player wins the hole. Does anyone remember what happened? So I guess it was 2017 at the President's Cup. With Jordan Spieth, it was in either, maybe it was a foursome match with, I'm drawing a blank. Was it Jason? I'm trying to remember who it was, but the international team had a putt to tie the Americans' side on the hole, and it went well past the hole, and Spieth just very nicely knocked it back while it was still in motion. Well, at the time, under the old rules, this provision didn't exist. So what was the ruling then? That the Americans were penalized for intentionally deflecting a ball in motion. Does that result make any sense in the world? No. And, I felt really, and that was a great example of the need to apply the rules properly as written, even when, deep down, there made no sense in the world. That the referee with that match, and Andy McPhee with the European Tour, knew full well what the rules said, knew full well that result made no sense whatsoever, but he was obligated to apply the rules. And that's why we have a rules change cycle, so that the RNA and the USGA could say, that result doesn't make sense. We need to change the rule. And now this provision's been added. But the important thing to note is it applies to a very specific set of facts. When the opponent needs to hold the stroke to tie, and the ball's deliberately deflected or stopped, when there's no reasonable chance it would be holed, then in that case, there's no penalty applied.
Now, do you know the history behind it? Is that something that was part of the original rule changes that they were talking about, or is that something that came to light?
Yeah, Phil, that's a good question. I don't know if that had been under discussion before the President's Cup incident. I don't think so, but I couldn't tell you for sure.
John, we have a question online, if you don't mind.
Oh, yes. Okay.
The question is, which breach of the rule takes priority when combining a round of stroke play and match play? And an example of this would be teeing off in the wrong order and stroke is canceled in match play.
Okay, which rule takes priority? Well, let's see. Well, I think we've got to look at that section of committee procedures for that here. This is a good exercise for everyone. Turn to Rules 6, Section 6C. Is that right? Yeah, Section 6C, which is on page 422, where oh, well, here we go. If we look at page 433, combining match play and stroke play. Now, the combining match play and stroke play is discouraged as certain rules are substantially different between the two formats. But there will be times where players request to combine two forms of play, or having done so on their own, request a ruling. The committee should make its best efforts to support players at these times and should use the following guidelines in doing so. So as Ken pointed out, this is a change for this year. If a committee chooses to allow players to play a match when competing in a stroke play competition, it's recommended that players be advised that the rules for stroke play apply throughout. For example, no concessions are allowed, and if one player plays out a turn, the other does not have the option of recalling that stroke. And then when players request a ruling, it should apply the rules as they would to each match play and stroke play separately. For example, if one player did not complete a hole for whatever reason, he or she is disqualified from stroke play, so forth. So the key there is that if the committee allows that, then it's recommended that the committee apply just the stroke play rules to that. So no concessions. So if someone were to play out of turn, for example, the opponent would not have the option to have that player recall that stroke. So as you can imagine, there could be a mess of problems, which is partly why the old rules did not allow that. But I think that was a concession to the fact that, well, that is happening, sometimes for efficiency purposes, and we should, and the rules should do what they can to offer some guidance for that.
So, John.
Yeah, Tim.
Phil tees off in front of the marker, and we're playing both, obviously.
Okay.
And he just smashes it right down the middle, 320 yards. I have no right to call that back.
Yeah.
Would not do it.
Well,
Does he get a two-stroke penalty?
Yeah. He's going to have a two-stroke penalty and then has to play from inside the team area. So
Match play.
yeah,
Match play?
yeah, because that's going to be one of those strange situations that.
Yeah.
And play two balls.
And again, that's part of the reason that it's not encouraged that committees do that. But I think it was just an acknowledgement that it's happening, and that's there's no point in disqualifying players, but just point out the shortcomings and try to deal with it as best you can, realizing it's going to be an imperfect situation. Let's see. All right, Rule 3.2A2, tying a hole. So a new term. Instead of previously talking about having a hole in match play, now it's tying a hole, which is, I guess you could say is more contemporary and more easily understood, perhaps. Holes tied if player and opponent complete the hole in the same number of strokes, or the player and opponent agree to treat the hole as tied as long as at least one of them teed off on the hole. So you could have a situation where, let's say, Tim and I have a match against each other, and some really, really complicated situation happens on the 8th hole. And, we really don't know, don't know what the right way to resolve it is. We could just say, geez, Tim, this is a mess. How about if we just say the hole's tied and we go on to the next hole? Tim says, yep, sounds good to me. This will allow players to do that in that case. Or, could be a situation where on a par three over water, long par three over water into the wind, both players hit their tee shots into the water. And they say, geez, we might be here a long day. And, we each only have, this is just the second hole of the day. And we only have 3 balls in our bag. So why don't we just consider the whole halved and save our ammo? And
But it says here, John, at least one player has made a stroke on the hole before that can be valid.
yeah, and part of the reason for that is to protect the principle of playing the round. That, in other words, to avoid the case where, let's say it's a yucky day outside like today, and Tim, you and I are scheduled to play a match in our club match play championship, and we say, geez, we're gonna catch pneumonia if we play today. Why don't we just agree to consider the first 17 holes halved and go the 18th hole, and that'll decide it. That it's to protect players from being able to do that. So they still have to play the round. All right, next page, winning a match. Player wins a match when the player leads the opponent by more holes than remain to be played, or the opponent concedes the match. Could be, for example, I remember 2003 U.S. Mid-Am player, severely hurt his ankle on the 9th hole of the first round of the 36-hole final. And it was clear that he wasn't going to be able to finish the match, and he conceded it after just 9 holes. Or the player is disqualified. Now, extending a tied match, this has been strengthened in the rule itself. Before, it just said, well, it's up to the committee to decide what to do. And this really now establishes a default position. That is that if the match is tied, the players will continue 1 hole at a time until there's a winner. It goes on to say that unless the committee says differently, you play the holes in the same order as during the round. So if you start on number 1, you walk off 18 tied, then you go back to number 1. But sometimes the committee might say, for other reasons, could be for TV reasons, spectator reasons, or course availability reasons, no, go to hole number 10 or something like that. But it does say, does acknowledge that the committee may say in terms of competition that a tied match will simply be a tied match. And we see that most often in team competitions, right? Like in the Ryder Cup, where if a match is tied, then each side gets half a point for that. The result of a match becomes final in the way stated by the committee. So something the committee should state beforehand. And that's something, again, note the reference in blue that the committee procedures section offers some guidance on. Some examples are when the result is recorded on an official scoreboard or other identified place. Could just be on the brackets in the locker room, or when the result is reported to a person identified by the committee. Could be to the golf shop staff, for example. Let's see, Rule 3.2B, concessions.
John, can I ask a question about the previous one?
Yeah.
Tying a hole on the previous page, it says a hole is tied, also known as halved. Does the WSGA have a preferred term to use? So if Gary Wild is doing the last match and the players tie the hole, is he supposed to say the match is all square, or is he supposed to say the match is tied?
Dan, that's a good question. I don't think the WSGA's had a formal discussion on that, but my inclination would be to use the word tied. That I think that's more easily understood, and also just in terms of audio, hearing the word halved, with the silent L is awkward. Can be awkward. Is not always understood. Where it's just the word tied, it's easy to hear. It's easily understood, and I'd be inclined to use tied. let's see. All right, concession, something that applies only in match play. Player may concede the opponent's next stroke, hole, or the match. So there are three things that can be conceded. Now, the most common by far is conceding the next stroke, which is allowed any time before that next stroke is made. The opponent has then completed the hole with a score that includes that conceded stroke, and the ball may be removed by anyone. So again, and that statement's a good example of something that, was well understood by golfers, but, if you were new to the sport and were just learning this, would you really understand if a stroke's been conceded, what a player's score for the hole is? So some nice explicit detail there. Now, another interesting point that the rules should address, and something that I think happens perhaps more often than we might think, and that is when a concession is made while a ball is in motion. It could be that, let's say, Arnold and I are playing. Arnold hits a putt, and as it's rolling past the hole, I say that's good. So what am I really conceding? I'm conceding his next stroke, assuming that his ball doesn't make a U-turn, go back into the hole, which is something sensible, but something that the previous rules did not really address that well. And the player may concede the opponent's next stroke by deflecting or stopping the ball in motion only if that's done specifically to concede the next stroke, and only when there's no reasonable chance the ball can be holed. So if Arnold's ball is going past the hole on a flat green, and I just reach over and knock the ball back to him, that's a way of conceding his next stroke. So if he'd been putting for a 3, that means his score would be 4 for the hole. Conceding a hole. This is allowed anytime before the hole's completed, including before the players even start the hole. And conceding the match, allowed anytime before the result of the match is decided, including before the players start the match. So if Dan and I have a match and I wake up and my back hurts so much I can't even get out of bed, I can just call Dan and say, Dan, I concede. Good luck in the next round. All right, now, again, some more information that a lot was taken for granted, but now was put in the rules, which will help, especially those new to the game, but also it'll help even those that have been playing for a while, how to make concessions. First point is a concession's made only when clearly communicated. So if it was not clearly communicated, then concession did not take place. And this can be done either verbally or by an action that clearly shows the player's intent to concede the stroke, the hole, or the match, such as making a gesture, such as motioning to the player to pick up his ball. Now, if the opponent lifts his or her ball in breach of a rule because of a reasonable misunderstanding that the player's statement or action was a concession of the next stroke, hole, or match, there's no penalty, and the player and the ball must be replaced on its original spot. So something that previously was tucked away in a decision, and now there's clear authority for that and result in the rule itself. And as before, a concession is final and cannot be declined or withdrawn. All right, let's see. Section 3.2C involving handicaps in match play. The player and opponent should tell each other their handicaps before the match. If a player declares the wrong handicap and does not correct the mistake before the opponent's next stroke, then the consequence will depend as to the nature of the wrong handicap. If the declared handicap was too high, and as a result, this affects the number of strokes the player would give or get, the player is disqualified. Now, if this is too low, then the player should shot himself in the foot and has to play out the match with the low handicap. Now, where the handicap strokes hole are applied, this is something that's determined by the committee. Handicap strokes are given by hole, and lower net score wins the hole. If a tied match is extended, handicap strokes are given by hole in the same way as during the round, unless the committee tells you to do something different. So in other words, if the match is tied, needs to extend hole by hole, and the first hole is the number 7 handicap hole, then if the player gets 7 or more handicap strokes, then he or she will get a stroke on that hole. Now, if the players mistakenly apply handicap strokes on a hole, the agreed result of the hole stands unless the players correct that mistake in time. And we'll see in a few minutes. Now, in match play, responsibilities of the player and opponent. We'll talk about a number of strokes taken and penalty and the match score. So these are all details that previously were lumped into the rule formerly known as wrong information, but now we have some new terms and they're broken out more by each section. Billy, welcome back from Florida. What time did you get up this morning?
3 Eastern.
3 Eastern. Okay. Well, that's only 2 here. Very, very good. Well, welcome back. Bill, we're on rule 3.2D. At any time during play of a hole or after the hole is completed, the opponent may ask the player for the number of strokes, which includes penalty strokes the player has taken. This is to allow the opponent to decide how to play the next stroke and the rest of the hole, or to confirm the result of the hole just complete. So again, it gives us the philosophical reason as to why this rule is the way it is, because in match play, knowing how your opponent stands can directly affect your own play. When asked for the number of strokes taken, or when giving that information without being asked, the player must give the right number of strokes taken, and a player who fails to respond to that request is treated as giving the wrong number of strokes taken. The player gets the general penalty, loss of hole, if he or she gives the opponent the wrong number of strokes taken, unless the player corrects the mistake in time. So what's the time window in which the player can correct the mistake? So there are 2 types of mistakes. Either one, having given the incorrect number, whether high. Let's say if Phil and I are playing, he says, "John, what do you lie?" And I really was lying 3 at the time, but I told him some number other than 3, whether 2, 4, 5, or what have you. Or he asked me and I'm annoyed because I'm 3 down to him and I don't answer. Then how long do I have to come to my senses and provide the correct information?
Before I left.
Well, let's see here. During the play of the hole, the player must give the right number of strokes taken before the opponent makes another stroke or takes a similar action, such as conceding the next stroke or the hole. So before Phil plays, I need to come clean and tell him what I like. Now, if this happens after the hole is completed, the player must give the right number of strokes taken before either one of the players tees off on the next hole, or if it's the final hole of the match, before the result of the match is final. And then an interesting exception that's not different than before. If the player gives the wrong number of strokes taken after a hole is completed, but this does not affect the opponent's understanding of whether the hole was won, lost, or tied, there is no penalty. So let's say, for example, Ken and I are playing a match, and after one hole, Ken, who scored 6 on the hole, says, "John, what'd you make?" And I said, "Ken, I made 4. So at that moment, what does Ken think the result of that hole was? That he lost. And then let's say we tee off on the next hole. We're walking down the next fairway. And I say, Ken, I'm sorry, I miscounted. I forgot that pitch out of the rough back there. I actually made a 5 on that hole. So is there any penalty in that case for me for not giving the right number of strokes? No, because with a 5, what was still the result of the hole? I still won the hole. So that's an example of the application of that exception. All right, now the next part of this rule is telling the opponent about a penalty. Now, when a player gets a penalty, player must tell the opponent as soon as reasonably possible, taking into account how near the player is to the opponent and other practical factors. So let's say, for example, that Ken's in the middle of the fairway and I'm in the woods to the right, 40 yards right of him, and I'm in some pretty deep woods. And I, let's say, when I'm getting ready to play, I accidentally nudge my ball. The ball moves, and let's say to make it as extreme a case as possible, I cause the ball to move in a way that would involve a penalty stroke, and during my swing, and I finish the swing and hit the ball. So we'll see later that's a 1-stroke penalty. But then let's say Ken, as soon as he sees my ball airborne, he immediately plays. Is there any problem with the fact that I didn't tell him about that penalty before he played? No, because it wasn't reasonable for me to tell him that. But if we're in the fairway, if I, near each other, then yes, then in that case, I would need, it would be reasonable for me to tell him before his stroke, and I'd have to do that. Now, an important part is this requirement applies even if the player does not know about the penalty. And a reminder back to Rule 1, because players are expected to recognize when they've breached the rule. So if the player fails to do so and does not correct that mistake before the opponent makes another stroke or takes a similar action, such as a concession, the player loses the hole. Now, there's an exception that there's no penalty if the opponent knew the player had a penalty, such as when the player is obviously taking penalty relief. So if Ken is watching me measure 2 club links, taking relief from a red penalty area, and sees me drop a ball, I don't need to turn to him 10 feet away and say, Ken, I just incurred a penalty stroke for taking relief from this penalty area, because he sees that. And it's clear what I'm doing. But if it's not clear, the player needs to tell his opponent that. All right, now what about the match score? Players are expected to know the match score. If players mistakenly agree on a wrong match score, such as, let's say Bill and I are playing and walking off the 8th green, I turn to Bill and say, Bill, all square? Bill says, yep. And that turns out not to be correct in whichever direction. Okay, or excuse me, or I should say tied, Dan, thank you. Then they may correct the match score before either player makes a stroke to begin the next hole, or if it's final hole before the result is final. So if we're after the 8th hole, we're walking to the 9th tee, and I say, Bill, tied up? He says, yep. And then right before, let's say Bill has the honor, he tees off, he says, oh, wait a minute, John, I actually think I'm 1 up. Then we can correct that mistake. But if that didn't happen, if we tee off number 9, thinking that the match is tied, and then in the 9th fairway, Bill says, whoa, hold on there, I'm actually 1 up. Too bad, the match is tied. Because if not corrected in that time, then that wrong match score becomes the actual score. And that's important, because if, when we tee off number 9, whether I'm tied or whether I'm 1 down, that could affect how I play from the 9th tee. So that's why that's the reason for the need for the immediate correction. And that's the exception. If the player makes a timely request for a ruling and it's found that the opponent either gave wrong number of strokes taken or failed to tell the player about a penalty, the wrong match score must be corrected, which makes sense. Protecting own rights and interests. The player in a match should protect their own players in a match should protect their own rights and interests under rules. If the player knows or believes the opponent has breached a rule that has a penalty, the player may act on the breach or choose to ignore it. We'll go through all this, then we'll go through some examples. But if the player and opponent deliberately agree to ignore a breach or penalty they know applies, both players are disqualified under Rule 1 for deliberately agreeing to ignore the rules. If the player and opponent disagree whether one of them has breached a rule, then either one may protect his rights by asking for a ruling. All right, so let's go through that, and especially the first two bullet points, because there can be a little bit of a fine line here, where let's say that, let's say Bill and I are playing a match, and on the fourth hole, Bill sees me under a tree, and there's a tree branch, small tree branch hanging out over my ball, and I reach down with my hands and snap that branch off so I can clearly see the ball and have a better swing. Bill sees that, and he says, geez, look, I won the first 3 holes, and I've got a short birdie putt here. It's clear I'm going to go 4 up. It's clear I'm going to win this hole anyway. I don't need to rub salt in John's wound by telling him that he breached the rule, so I'm just not going to say anything. Then we finish out the hole, and walking down the next fairway, Bill says, John, just so you know for future use, reference that when you're under a tree, you're not allowed to break off branches to improve the area of intended stance or swing or line of play. And I say, oh gosh, really? Oh, I didn't know that. Well, thanks, Bill. Now, what's the ruling there? Have he and I done anything wrong in that case?
No,
No, and why is that?
you didn't deliberately agree to waive a rule.
That's right. And the key here is the timing as to when Bill and I have that discussion. When we're walking down the next hole, could Bill still ask for a ruling to have a penalty applied to that previous hole?
No.
And the answer is no, because why? Because he saw what I did. He knew the facts of what I did before we teed off on that next hole. So therefore, since it's too late to apply a penalty, we're not deliberately agreeing not to apply a penalty because it's impossible for a penalty to be applied. So that would be the nice thing to do, or the right way under the rules to do the nice thing. Now, the wrong way to do the nice thing would be if right after I did that, Bill rushed over and said, John, you're not allowed to do that. When you're not allowed to break off natural objects to improve your area of intended swing. And I said, gosh, Bill, I'm sorry, what's the penalty? Bill says, well, normally it's a loss of hole penalty, but we don't have to apply that now. I say, gosh, Bill, that's really, really nice of you. Thank you. Now, in that case, when that happens during play of that hole, what's the ruling? After we have that conversation, then we're just both disqualified, aren't we? Because now we've deliberately agreed to not to apply a penalty. So it's the same conversation, but it occurs at a different spot. So that's the difference between agreeing to overlook something. And again, you can certainly overlook something without having any conversation with anybody versus agreeing not to apply a penalty. And then with the last section, that if Bill says, John, you're not allowed to do that, that's a penalty, I say, I don't think you know what you're talking about. I mean, we have a disagreement, then Bill can say, as we'll see later on Rule 20, that he wants to get a ruling on what I did about the tree branch I broke off. All right, now let's shift gears and get into stroke play, and keeping in mind the very different nature of stroke play, where let's say, in match play, it's one-on-one. In stroke play, it could be one against 155 other players. And you need to make sure that at the end of the day in stroke play that everything is treated equitably and that you're comparing apples to apples. So we say, seeing the purpose, stroke play has specific rules, especially for scorecards and holing out. Each player competes against all other players, and all players need to be treated equally under the rules. And then after the round, the player and the marker have to return the player's scorecard. Rule 3.3a, the winner in stroke play. The player who completes all rounds in the fewest strokes is the winner. In a handicap competition, this means the fewest total net strokes. And a reminder that, in any competition, the committee should state beforehand how ties will be decided, because it's extremely awkward to settle that only once a tie has occurred. Scoring in stroke play. Unlike in match play, in stroke play, there is a scorecard. And the score is kept by the marker, who's either identified by the committee or chosen by the player in a way approved by the committee. The player must use the same marker for the entire round unless the committee approves a change before or after it happens. So, most common time that occurs is, let's say, if a player withdraws during the round, perhaps for injury, perhaps for bad golf, and the player needs to have another marker. Now, what's the marker's responsibility? After each hole during the round, the marker should, it's a good idea, but it's not a requirement, confirm with the player number of strokes taken on that hole, including penalty strokes, and enter that gross score on the scorecard. Now, after the round, the marker must certify the hole scores on the scorecard, which, in WSGA events will mean signing the paper scorecard. If the player had more than one marker, then each marker would certify the scores for those holes. So if a player had person A as the marker for the front nine, and person B has the marker for the back nine, then each marker would need to sign for that part of it. Then on the next page, you'll see a nice diagram with color-coded that does a nice job of showing, who's responsible for what. That we start by looking at blue with the committee. The committee is responsible for issuing the scorecard. It has the player's name, has the date, and the committee is also responsible for adding up the scores and applying the handicap. The player is responsible for certifying the scorecard, in this case by signing it. Then both the player and the marker are responsible for filling out the hole-by-hole gross scores and making sure that the marker has certified the scorecard. All right, now the player's responsibility. First, a recommendation during the round, the player should, good idea but not a requirement, keep track of his or her scores for each hole. You often see, including at WSGA events and scorecards that have a little perforated strip at the top where a player can keep his own score, his own unofficial score during the round. Now, after the round, the player should carefully check the hole scores entered by the marker, raise any issues with the committee, make sure the marker certifies the hole scores on the scorecard, must not change a score entered by the marker except with the marker's agreement or the committee's approval. So that's a nice addition, kind of confirming the common practice. And must certify the whole scores on the scorecard and promptly return it to the committee, after which the player must not change the scorecard. So just as before, no changes to the scorecard after it's been returned to the committee. So if the player breaches any of these requirements, the player is disqualified. So that means that and we'll see an exception here, but if the player returns the scorecard without the marker's signature on it, that the player, not the marker, is going to be penalized for that. That the player is responsible for making sure the marker's signature is on the scorecard when he returns it. But then necessary exception here, that there's no penalty if the committee finds that the player's breach of the above rule was caused by the marker's failure to carry out his or her responsibilities, such as the marker leaving with the player's scorecard or without certifying the scorecard, so long as this was beyond the player's control. And that's the important part, beyond the player's control. So for example, if both the player and the marker are there inside the WSGA scoring tent, and the player ultimately returns the scorecard without the marker's signature on it, then the player is going to get disqualified. This exception covers a case where you have, let's say, a really hot-headed player who, after his final round, just doesn't shake anyone's hands, immediately hops over the fence into his car and speeds away without, handing over the player's scorecard. Then in that case, you can't penalize the player for that. So that's just an acknowledgement of what's hopefully a very rare situation. All right, wrong score for hole, and this is a change, or one aspect of it. If the player returns a scorecard with the wrong score for any hole, if the return score was higher than the actual score, then the higher return score for the hole stands. Best example of that, again, Roberto DiVincenzo at the 1968 Masters. He made a birdie 3 on the 71st hole, instead returned a scorecard with a par 4 for it, so he was stuck with a par 4 and missed the playoff by 1. But if the return score is lower than the actual score, or if no score is returned, if the score for the 5th hole is just blank, other than in specific competitions formats, then the player is disqualified.
Jackie Pung.
Yep. Jackie Pung in I think it was 1957 U.S. Women's Open made a 6 on, was it the 4th hole, but returned a score of 5. There were no penalty strokes or anything. It was just a simple mistake. So she made a 5. She made a 6, but returned a 5, so she would still be disqualified. Now, there is a specific exception. If one or more of the player's hole scores are lower than the actual scores because he or she excluded one or more penalty strokes that the player did not know about before returning the scorecard, the player is not disqualified. And if the mistake is found before the close of competition, the committee would then revise the player's score by adding the penalty strokes that should have been included in the score for that hole or holes under the rules. And we'll go through an example of this, but let's just finish this. This exception does not apply when the excluded penalty is disqualification. So in other words, if you earn penalty of disqualification, you will still be disqualified. Or when the player was told that a penalty might apply or was uncertain whether a penalty applied and did not raise this with the committee before returning the scorecard. So let's go over a couple of examples. And a common example, remember way back in 1987, Craig Stadler kneeling on a towel during the 3rd round of the tournament at San Diego. The tour became aware of this breach during the 4th round. So under the old rules, what was Stadler's penalty was what? Disqualification. So if that were to happen at this year's tournament in San Diego, that he knelt on a towel to play a ball during the 3rd round, and then during the 4th round, the committee becomes aware of this, what would the committee do? Well, first they would talk with them and say, you knelt on a towel. Did you know that that was a breach for improving the area of intended stance? He'll say, I had no clue. I was just trying to keep my trousers clean. All right. So in that case, what would the committee do? Well, it would add the 2-stroke penalty that he would incur under current Rule 8 and apply that to a score for that hole for the 3rd round. And that's it. And there's no additional penalty above and beyond that. Now, what would be the ruling if Stadler knelt on the towel in the 3rd round? Another player said, hey, Craig, I don't think you can do that. You might want to talk to an official. That doesn't quite seem right. He says, oh, no, that's fine. That's fine. And then he returns the score, and the next day the committee becomes aware of this. Then what would the ruling be? Then he'd be disqualified. Why? Because of this this final bullet point, because he was made aware that there could be an issue with that. And once he's made aware of it, he's then responsible to make sure that he returns the correct score for that hole, which he didn't do. So then he would be disqualified.
So there's no longer a penalty for returning an incorrect scorecard.
Well, I hesitate to say it in quite in those terms, because if you return an incorrect score for simple bad math, let's say there are no penalty strokes involved. Let's say I have a horrible hole. I think I made an 8, so I return my marker and we return an 8, but in fact we forgot about one shot I hit in the rough that went a foot, so I actually made a 9. Then I'd still be disqualified. But if my score was lower than actually taken because of a penalty, because I did not include a penalty I was unaware of, then there's no penalty for returning the incorrect score, but the committee would go back and add the penalty that I should have included originally. So in the Craig Stadler case, he would wind up with a total penalty of 2 strokes added to his score.
So Lexi Thompson wouldn't happen where they walk out and say you got 4 penalty scores. It would only be 2.
That's all right. With the Lexi
That's what
Thompson.
I meant.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So in that case,
That's what I meant.
yeah, we did have for several years a situation where there would be the penalty the player incurred under whatever rule he or she breached, plus an additional 2-stroke penalty. And that additional 2-stroke penalty no longer exists. Oh yeah. And with Lexi Thompson, and it then raises the question of going back to what we looked at under Rule 1 with reasonable judgment. Did she do her best to replace that ball? And that's a discussion I'd probably prefer not to have. Whenever I ask other people and say, well, okay, wow, that's very interesting. So what would that change the outcome in the Lexi Thompson case? Well, let's not talk about old situations and all that. So, all right, scoring and handicap competition. The player is responsible for making sure that his or her handicap is shown on the scorecard. The player returns a scorecard without the right handicap. Well, if the handicap is too high, or if no handicap is shown, and this affects the number of strokes the player gets, the player is disqualified, but note only from the handicap competition. So if there's a gross competition as well, it makes sense for the player still to be in it. If the handicap on the scorecard is too low, then the net score with that lower handicap stands. The player is not responsible for adding the scores or applying the handicap. That's the committee's responsibility. If the player returns a scorecard on which he or she made a mistake in adding up the scores or in applying handicap strokes, there's no penalty for doing so. So therefore, players shouldn't necessarily be gun shy about trying to help the committee with math. Failure to hole out, something that's an integral part of stroke play. Player must hole out at each hole in the round. If the player fails to hole out, the player must correct that mistake before making a stroke to begin another hole, or for the final hole of the round before returning the scorecard. If the mistake is not corrected in that time, then the player is disqualified. And we'll see that there are a few forms of stroke play, such as Stableford, where player's not going to be disqualified for failing to hole out. It's just that the player doesn't, in Stableford, for example, earn any points on that hole. All right, well, that is Rule 3. Any questions on that? Yeah, Gary.
Or probably more of a comment, but, the Lexi case versus John Rahm when he moved his mark, and in moving it back, obviously you can see that he did not move it back relatively close to where it was originally, and then replaced his ball. And obviously he just said, I thought I put it back accordingly. But the distance that the ball changed was no different than the Lexi case.
Okay,
Which
what?
I think that it's kind of a, I think you can try and put it back, but obviously it wasn't.
Well, tell me more about the John Rahm case. I don't remember that. Was that last year or?
Last year he moved his mark because someone else was going to play close to his mark.
Okay.
And in replacing, we always look at a tree in the distance or whatever to replace it. When he replaces it, you can see that it definitely went closer to the hole. And in that particular case, they interviewed him, and he said, "I thought they showed him the video. He said, I thought I had, put it back to where it was originally, which was probably more off than Lexi's case." And obviously, because he said he did his best, he incurred no penalty.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't remember that, but that's a good example, and it gets back to, let's take a look back on page 20 about the new, reasonable judgment rule. So that so long as the player does what can be reasonably expected under the circumstances to make an accurate determination, the player's reasonable judgment will be accepted. So it's a question of, and no pun intended, but it's kind of a judgment call by the committee. Did the player do what was reasonably expected in the circumstances?
I mean, that's what happens in most of the situations that we get into, without someone coming up and having a video of exactly what happened. A spectator videoing something in a high school tournament, a collegiate tournament, whatever the case may be, WSGA event, anything of that nature. When it comes up and we're fact finding, there are situations where, one of the players isn't paying attention. One of the players or opponents is, and now it becomes like he said, she said. There's mixed in.
Jim, that's good. I like that. Yeah, well, I think that's a good point. That at our events, in that deal with the Golf Channel didn't quite come through for this year, but maybe for 2020, I think Rob's still in negotiations with them. That we don't have the benefit, or in some cases, some might argue the curse of a television. That you're out between the 5th and 6th holes, and Gary, you get called over to the 3rd green, saying, one player saying, "Hey, so and so replaced this ball closer to the hole, blah blah blah," and as you said, invariably, what's going to happen? One player isn't wanting anything to do with it. Right. Other players adamant that this player is trying to cheat. The other person acts as if you've just offended him and his family. And first and foremost, as an official, all you can do is try to piece together the facts. And it's a very difficult and awkward situation without any other evidence. When you said just one player's word against the other, and if all you can do is gather all evidence you can, and if at the end of the day it looks like it's a toss-up, and most of the time in cases like that, you give the player, the owner of the ball, the benefit of the doubt with that. But let's say situation that is televised, that can add another aspect to it. And sometimes do you say, well, did the player do the best that he or she could given the circumstances? Because one way to look at it is, I think some people will say that in theory it's impossible to replace a ball on exactly where it was. That anytime you're replacing a ball, you're going to get it to some degree off. It might be a few millimeters or what have you. So it's a question of, is it good enough? Did you do well as you could, or could you clearly have done better? For example, if your dime's on the ground and you replace the ball 2 inches in front of it, you could have done better than that you didn't do the best you could. But, and unfortunately, that leaves a gray area as to what falls under this reasonable judgment standard. It can be tough. Yeah, Bill.
To that point, in our rules seminar, David Stabler and John Vandervoort were talking about how David Stabler at the USGA Test Center set up a camera that wouldn't move, and had the entire rules staff mark a ball, lift it, clean it, and replace it. And also mark a ball, move it with a coin, and put it back. And only like 2% of the time was the ball put exactly on the spot when you just marked it and lifted. When it was moving it with a putter head, never was it. And that was fascinating to know.
Well, that's interesting that for those of you joining us online, Bill talked about a anecdote he heard at the recent PGA USGA rules class, where the USGA and the test center conducted an experiment with a camera locked in a certain position, and they had a number of staff come through, mark the position of lift, replace a ball, and then as well as move a ball, a putter at length to the side and replace it. And they said in terms of players just lifting the ball, that 2% of the time or so it was replaced exactly on the right spot. And even then, part of me wonders if that's even possible to be exactly on the spot, and that when the ball had to be moved or putter at length to the side, that really never was it replaced on the spot. So I think, it helps to start from that perspective and to say, look, in these cases, we're realistically never going to get it exactly right. So it's a matter of how much of a margin for error are we willing to accept, in what the player did. Is what the player did reasonable given the circumstances? For lack of a better term, is it good enough, or could the player have done better? But that's a really, really good example. Okay, anything else on Rule 3? All right, if not here, why don't we take a 15-minute break, and Dan will resume things at 10:10.
Question.
Yeah, Gary.
You tournament directors, the heads of our committee, wisely told us to keep a blank slate with regard to these new rules, something which was easy for me to do. Now I've come here and I see we have 2 documents, and in the past when we had our rules study sessions, we just had 1 book, and the decisions book was in the form of questions and answers, and we always covered those right while we were covering a rule. So I guess my question to you is, what do we do with this book, and are we going to go over those at some point in the future, or how's that?
Gary, well, good question. In terms of what to do with the what we're calling the big book, the official guide, intentionally we are using the rules book because 99% of everything that'll come up this year during our season will be covered by this, and also to help everyone, myself included, become more and more familiar with using this book, with finding our way around with the format, and also because the format of the rules in here is easier to follow than the format of the rules and the official guide. And that if, for example, with the official guide, there's a format difference from last year. And it's interesting and helpful when you're looking for the specific interpretations, but when you're mainly focusing on the rules, it can be a little challenging. And that is that the interpretations themselves have come after each section where they apply rather than at the end of the rule. So as a result, you don't have just the entire rule by itself and then the interpretations. So every now and then you'll have like a section of a rule standing out by itself, sandwiched between some interpretations. So it's easier to read the rules in here. But Dan and I will be referring to some interpretations in here, but not as much as before, for the simple reason that so much more information is now in here than before. And the interpretation format, and we'll take a minute just to talk about here, is very different. That it's not the old question and answer format that you mentioned. Rather, with most interpretations, the first paragraph will simply state the principle, which in many cases is repeating what the rule says, and then it will go on to provide an example or two of that. So for now, and we're going to focus on this, but we will somewhat sparingly, and that's by intention, refer to some interpretations in here. So if you have both books, I think for each session it's worthwhile to bring both, but we're going to spend 99% of our time with just the rules book.
Gary, to another point, in the old rules, many of them could only be found in the decisions. And that was part of the problem that the USGA found, is that they had rules that weren't in the book. They were only in the decision. They have tried to move everything into the rule book. And there's really no unwritten rules in the guide that there used to be in the decision.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So, okay, with that, thank you, Gary. That's worthwhile to go over. All right, well, it's 15 minutes. We'll resume now. Let's say at 10:15.
You got up too early.
We're going to cover Rule 4. One of the things that you may or may not know is the rules are, quote, shorter than they were in 2018. And the USGA comes to that conclusion by saying they went from 34 rules down to 24 rules. When we cover Rule 4, we're going to see that it's a combination of the old 4 and 5. So it's pretty easy how you shrink the number of rules down, is you just put 2 rules into the same rule. And you'll see that with the old 1617 are put into Rule 13 now. The other thing is, if you count the actual pages in the old rules book, counting all the definitions and all of the rules, it was 104 pages. If you count them under the new rules book, it's 204 pages. So basically, the rules have doubled, but there's 2 reasons for that. One is there are a number of illustrations which are very helpful that obviously take up space and not words. And what's the second reason?
There's more words.
Oh, yes, thank you, Bill. Bill reminded me what I was going to say. They have taken about 500 decisions and put them actually into the wording of the rules themselves. All right, so Rule 4 is the old Rule 4 on clubs, Rule 5 on equipment, and Rule 14.3, which was artificial devices, unusual equipment, and abnormal use of equipment. So those are now into Rule 4, and that's what we're going to be discussing. Before we go over the specific rule, I want to point out so there's 5 notable changes. I think this is on the USGA's website, and that is for each rule, they have the notable changes in that rule. And it's very helpful. If you don't have it, I know that Bill or Jeff can forward that out. It's like 25 pages or something, but it's very helpful. So Rule 4, the notable changes. Gary Wild is holding it up, so he has something. The notable changes are no penalty for carrying a non-conforming club, penalty only for making a stroke. That's the first change. Second change, a player may repair any damage to the club that occurred during a round. The normal course of play limitation on repair has been eliminated. A third notable change, if an adjustable feature on a club has been purposely changed, it may be restored without penalty. A fourth change, damaged ball. It could only be substituted if it's cut or cracked, no longer if it's, quote, out of shape. I don't know what it means to be out of shape, but you can't have it anymore. And the last major change under Rule 4 is rules now permit distance measuring devices. So let's look at the wording of Rule 4. As John pointed out, one of the nice things about the new rules is the purpose statement, Rule 4 covers equipment that the player may use during the round based on the principle that golf is a challenging game in which success should depend on the player's judgment, skill, or ability. So if you keep that in mind, that it's based on judgment, skill, or ability, that's why you don't want the player to be able to use electronic devices that manipulate data so as to tell the player where to hit, how to hit, and so forth. 4.1 is on clubs, so we'll go over that. In making a stroke, a player must use a club that conforms to the requirements in the equipment rules. Notice that it is in making a stroke. You can carry whatever clubs you want, even if they don't conform. It's the making of the stroke that triggers the penalty. A club used to make a stroke must conform not only when the club is new, but also when it has been deliberately or accidentally changed in any way. And then here's the exception. If the performance characteristics of a club, conforming club change because of wear through normal use, it's still a conforming club. And there's interpretation talking about if the grooves of the club wear down, that's okay. If the shaft, the grip area has some indentations because you've gripped it so hard and so long that you got a little thumb mark, that's okay. And performance characteristics means any part of the club that affects how it performs in making a stroke, such as its grip, shaft, club head, or lie or loft. Parent 2, use or repair of clubs changed during round. This is one of the changes. If a conforming club is damaged during a round or while play is stopped, the player normally must not replace it with another club. And then the exception, but no matter what the nature of the damage, the club is treated as conforming for the rest of the round. So as the top of the next page points out, for the rest of the round, the player may continue to make a stroke with the damaged club or have it repaired. So if you're on the first tee, actually the first teeing area, because if you're on the first tee, it's the little device that holds the ball up, so you've got to use correct terminology. If you're on the first teeing area and you take a wild swing and you smash the front of your driver in and it's now in not very good shape, you cannot repair that driver for the next 17 holes. You're stuck with that driver. However, the good news is, for what it's worth, is you can use it. And this also applies if you took your driver after hitting a rather lousy shot on the first hole and you banged your driver, abused it as it were, on the ground, and you bent the shaft and the head and it was kind of crumpled. Again, you couldn't replace it, but the good news is you can use that for the rest of the round. Continuing on, you can have the club repaired. Generally, the term repaired applies to two things. The interpretations point this out. Repair generally speaks about an adjustable type club where the screws become slightly loose. And what you're allowed to do is you can repair it, which means to restore it as nearly as possible. So if it's in slot number 3 and it comes loose and now it's in slot number 1 or it's sliding around, you can put it back to 3. You can't put it to any other adjustment. That's considered repair. Another example of repair is if you use lead tape on your club and it came detached, you could put it back on. If the lead tape would no longer stick, you are permitted to use a replacement lead tape, but again, it has to be an identical size, shape, weight, and so forth. The idea is that you are restoring the club as nearly as possible. You're not changing it in any fashion to get an advantage. And as we talked about, damage during a round means not only making a stroke, but also stuff like taking the club in and out of the bag, and interestingly enough, abuse. So again, if you abuse your club, you break it, at least bend it, it is damaged during the round and you can continue to use it for the remainder of that round. So in the high school tournaments, when the kid bends his putter over his knee, last year they had to take the putter out of play and had to putt with another club. Now the player will be able to continue to use that putter at least for the rest of the round. Questions on that? Parent 3, deliberately changing club's performance characteristics during the round. A player must not make a stroke with a club whose performance characteristics he or she has deliberately changed during the round. Again, the word is deliberately. Throughout the rules, that is now the buzzword. We no longer say intent, it's always deliberate or accidental. And apparently that was done for purposes of translating into foreign languages. Anyways, by using an adjustable feature, you can't change the club by using an adjustable feature. And you also can't apply substance to the club head to affect its performance. The exception, and this is interesting, the exception only applies to the adjustment to the club. It does not apply to adding foreign substance to the club. So if you have an adjustable club and you're on the first tee, you change it, or you've made a swing, and now you're on the second hole, you adjust it from 3 to 4, and somebody in your group says, I'm sorry, you can't do that. This exception says if you put it back to what it was, which I guess was 3, you're not going to get a penalty and you can continue to use that. Notice if you take your club head and you put a substance on it, such as a Vaseline or whatever they use to make the ball go straight, even if you clean it off, that club is not a qualifying or conforming club, and you're going to be disqualified if you make a stroke. So again, that adjustment, the exception only applies to adjustable feature of the club. Penalty for stroke, for making a stroke in breach of 4.1a. And again, the thing to remember there is it's for making a stroke. If you have a non-conforming club and you don't use it, no penalty. But the last line there, the club still counts towards the 14 club rule. All right, 4.1b, the so-called 14 club rule, limit of 14 clubs, sharing, adding, or replacing clubs. Player must not start a round with more than 14 or have more than 14 clubs during the round. If the player has fewer than 14, he can add any number up to the 14. And there are certain restrictions that we'll talk about under parent 4 of the clubs that he can add. When the player becomes aware that he or she is in breach of this rule by having more than 14 clubs, the player must immediately, and I would underscore the word immediately, take the excess clubs out of play. And we're going to see in just a minute that if you don't do it immediately, you don't just get the 2 or the 4 penalty strokes, you're disqualified. So you're going to want to take the action immediately once you become aware of the 14 clubs. If you start with more than 14, he or she may choose which clubs to take out of play. So if you start with 16 and you're on the 3rd hole and Gary says, gee, you got 16 clubs, and you say, oh, I guess that's right. I can pick the 2 that I want to take out of play. If I start with 14 and then I add 2 on the 3rd hole and I'm caught or become aware of it, I have to take the 2 clubs that I added out of play. I can't take any other 2. The last paragraph under parent 1 there, I believe was previously in a rules decision, and it's just kind of a common sense situation. It allows the player not to get a penalty if he's trying to do a good deed. After a player's round has started, if a player picks up another player's club that was left behind, or the club is mistakenly put in the player's bag without him or her knowledge, the club is not treated as one of the players. So if you see a club along the side of the fairway or alongside the green, you can pick it up and you can put it in the cart and there's not going to be a penalty. Sharing of clubs. Player is limited to the clubs he or she has started with and must not make a stroke with a club being used by anyone else who was playing in the on the course. Again, the emphasis there is on the word make a stroke. So although you can't share clubs, if you're between holes and you want to borrow your partner's putter to practice on the last green, if that's permitted, or the teeing ground of the next teeing area, you're permitted to do that because you're not making a stroke with the club. Stroke means a stroke that is a stroke that counts in the score. And then when the player becomes aware that he or she has breached this rule by having more than 14 clubs, you must immediately, and there's that word again, you have to do it immediately. And you have to use the procedure in paragraph C, which we're going to look at in a little bit. The blue items, the blue language there, the blue wording, C rules 22.5 and 23.7. We'll see when we get to 22.2, which is foursomes, and 23, which is four ball, that players are allowed to share clubs. They just can't have a total of, they can't have more than 14 between them.
Dan, we have a question from online.
Go ahead.
The question is, what happens if you start with 15 clubs, but one is a non-conforming club, such as a weighted club, only used before the round, but never intended to be used for a swing during the round? Is it considered a training aid?
It's an excellent question. We'll cover it. If you can just hold off for about 10 minutes, we'll cover that. If I haven't, Jeff, remind me and I'll cover it then.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Parent 3, no replacing lost or damaged clubs. We talked about this. If you, this is a change. If you lose a club, you can't replace it. If you start with 14 clubs, you can add up to 14. But if you damage one, you can't replace it. There is an exception, and that is if it's done by someone other than you or your partner or caddy. So if you're playing the third hole and somebody from another group runs their cart across your driver and snaps it in two, the exception on the top of page 39 tells you that you can replace it. But notice that when you do replace it, the player must immediately take the damaged club out of play using the procedure, which we're going to talk about in a minute. I emphasize this because it's not enough just to get a new club. If you leave the old club in your bag, you could be disqualified because you have not used the procedure to take it out of play. All right, restrictions on adding or replacing clubs. When adding or replacing a club under 14 club rule, you must not unreasonably delay play. That makes sense. You notice that's a new term. It used to be called undue delay. It's now unreasonable delay. You cannot add or borrow a club from anyone else playing on the course, even if the other player is playing in a different group. And notice that it's on the course. So you could borrow a club if the player is finished the round. Also, you cannot build a club from parts carried by anyone for or on behalf of the player. So the player himself cannot carry that, put the clubs together, and he cannot have somebody else go along and carry them. There is, however, make sure you understand this, there's no penalty for carrying component parts in your bag. So you could carry 2 extra driver heads if you wanted and 2 extra shafts. The problem is you can't put them together and use them during the round, but there's no penalty for the mere fact that you have carried component parts. All right, penalty for breach of 1.4B. This is significant. We'll go through this. What's significant is this is the only adjustment penalty left in the rules of golf. John, is that correct? Okay. There used to be 3 or 4 other ones. If you had a caddy, depends on when you had it, and you could get an adjustment penalty, the 1 ball rule. This is now the only one that is left. The penalty applies based on when the player becomes aware of the breach. If the player becomes aware of the breach while playing the hole, the penalty is applied at the end of the hole. In match play, the player must complete the hole, apply the result, and then apply the penalty to the match. We'll go through an example. Player becomes aware of the breach between 2 holes, the penalty applies to the end of the last hole. Anyone who is thinking about taking the national test, here's a little point. 4.1B, limit of 14 clubs. This is the odd rule. Whenever you see something that says the 14 club rule, a little red flag should go up because it's the only adjustment penalty, and it's the only time I'm aware of where a penalty between 2 holes is applied to the last hole rather than the next hole. John Morissette's is thinking. John may come up with something, but as a good rule of thumb, remember that when you're on the national test. The penalty in match play, it's an adjustment penalty. In the example that they give, if a player who starts with 15 clubs becomes aware of a breach while playing the 3rd hole and then wins the hole to go 3 up in the match, the maximum adjustment penalty is 2 holes, and the player would then be only 1 up. Another example, you play the 1st hole, you lose it. You play the 2nd hole, you lose it. Somebody looks in your bag, you got 15 clubs. Well, it wasn't your day. You're now going to be 4 down, and you've only played 2 holes. That's what an adjustment penalty is. In the stroke play part of this, it's a maximum of 4 strokes. So it's 2 strokes for each of the holes up to a maximum of 4 penalty strokes. All right, 4.1 C. This is the procedure for taking clubs out of play. And under the 14 club rule, you are required to use this procedure. And you have to do it immediately. When a player becomes aware during a round that he or she is in breach of the 14 club rule for having more than 14 clubs or making a stroke with another player's club, the player must immediately take an action that clearly indicates each club that is being taken out of play. This may be done. Notice it doesn't say these are the 2 exclusive methods. It simply says it may be done by either declaring this to the opponent or taking some other clear action, such as turning the club upside down in a bag. Obviously, good practice is you should do both. You should tell your opponent that you're declaring it out of play. There seems to me there's no downside to declare it out of play, then there's no room for doubt. If you just turn it upside down, it could be questioned, why did you do that? Maybe you didn't take it out of play. Player must not make a stroke for the rest of the round with any club taken out of play. If the club is taken out of play, is another player's club, that other player can still use it. Obviously, if you're on the tee, you reach into somebody else's bag and you use his driver, you've now breached the 14 club rule, but that doesn't stop the person who was innocent from getting his driver back and using it. That's what that's saying. The last part before a round, and this is going to get to the question that Jeff asked, this parent 2 before a round used to be in a rules decision. Prior to 2016, if you got to the first tee with 15 clubs, discovered that you had 15 clubs, took one of the clubs out, put it on the floor of your golf cart, and started the round, you breached the rule. because you, quote, started the round with more than 14 clubs. That was uniformly hated, that decision. 2016, they put in the precursor to this in a decision, and it is now slightly changed, and it is now part of the rules. And again, that is one of the things that the USGA and the RNA should be most proud of, is the fact that they got rid of many of the decisions and put them into the rules themselves. So that's why, in theory, you should only have to know the rules and not the decisions. So let's look at it. If a player becomes aware shortly before starting a round that he or she accidentally, that's the key word, has more than 14 clubs, the player should try and leave it behind. But as an option without penalty, the player may take the excess club out of play before the start of the round using the procedure above, and the excess club may be kept by the player but not be used. If a player deliberately brings more than 14 clubs, then this does not apply. So take an example. You're on the range, you got 15 clubs, you're trying to decide which driver. All of a sudden it's your tee time. You go up to the first teeing area and you say, oh, I made a mistake, I forgot to take one out. This is allowing you to take the club out, declare it unplayable, but still carry it in the golf cart or even in your golf bag for the rest of the round. But notice the word accidental versus deliberate. If you're on the range, you have 16 clubs, you know you have 16 clubs, you say, I'm going to go to the first tee, and when I get there, I'm going to make my decision. So you go to the first teeing area, and you're undecided, and finally you say, oh, I'm going to use this driver. This does not apply. So what this means is you've started the round with more than 14 clubs. Now, I believe the question online was, a person starts with 14 clubs and has a non-conforming club such as a Medicus in the bag. That Medicus is a non-conforming club, however, it counts towards the 14 club rule, so the player would in fact get a penalty for having more than 14 clubs. I think that was Jeff's question, wasn't it?
Correct.
Any questions on 14.1 with clubs? Yeah, John.
I'm a little bit confused because it says, if you look at 4.1C1, it says if the club taken out of play is another player's club, that other player may continue to use the club.
Yes.
Does that insinuate that they have to be in your group?
No. That just means if a club's taken out of play, you have to take out any club. If you have 14 clubs and you use another club, you have now taken 15 clubs. You've violated that rule, and so you can't use it. If it's somebody else's club, the other person isn't going to get penalized. He can, of course, use his club.
If you found a player's club on the course, subsequently use that club, that would be when you started with 14, you found the club, used it, you'd be in breach of the 14 club rule. You would take that club out of play, and if the rightful owner then you found out whose club it was, that player could then use that club.
So that's different than the result we arrived at Pine Hills with Nader Akru, when someone else picked up his club on the putting green and started the round with it. Nader found the other gentleman's club, left it at the clubhouse. But when we found it, when the other player turned it in, we told Nader that he could no longer use that club because it had been put in play by someone else. Does that change under this? Do you remember that? It was at Pine Hills.
I wasn't part of that incident. I don't remember that incident. If you start with your clubs and someone has, during that round, used your club, that does not affect your ability to use it, even though they are required to declare it out of play.
Were you saying this happened before the round? So you're saying that the player started with his 14 clubs and then another player's club wound up in his bag?
No, what he did is he picked up the wrong club on the putting green, put it in his bag, so he had no more than 14. But one of them was not his. Native found the other club, turned it in, and subsequently relocated his club, but when we returned it to him, we told him he could not use it.
All right, let me see if I can, spell that out for the people listening online. A player has 14 clubs just before he's going to start. One of them is he's putting with on the putting green, and by mistake, he picks up the wrong putter. So he has now started with 14 clubs. He is not in breach of the 14 club rule. However, one of those clubs is not his. The player who then is about to start the round now has his original 13 clubs plus a putter of another player, and he wants to be able to use the putter of the player who has already started the round. I think that's the question. And the question,
Before the round, he didn't start with the 13 club. He only had 13 clubs in his bag. He turned it into the pro shop.
so I guess I'm not sure. If he starts with only 13 clubs, obviously he can add one more.
Except that we told him he could not use it because it had been put in play by someone else. Playing on the course.
Of course, yes, and that's still the rule.
That's still the rule in spite of what it says here?
Yes, that's how I read it.
Yeah,
Because you cannot, and this is you, and this is under 4 on the restrictions of what club you can add. If you look on page 39, it says restrictions. You cannot add or borrow any club from anyone else who is playing on the course.
Even if it belongs to you.
The rule says what it says. Add or borrow any club.
Check your bag. Seniors, check your bag.
Except that 401C1 contradicts them. But it says, if a club taken out of play is another player's club, that other player may continue to use the club.
Continue, that is
Yeah.
you started with it.
Yeah,
Lost it
exactly.
somewhere in,
Right.
lost it somewhere in like transit.
Yeah, I think that really contemplates a case where, let's say, John, you and I are sharing a cart and we have the same irons. And by accident, I put my 6-iron in your bag, then you pull it out, you make a stroke with it, and you realize, oh gosh, I just used John's 6-iron. Then, you have to declare my 6-iron out of play, but then I can use that 6-iron again.
But if you had started the round with his 6-iron,
Senior bag.
and you only had 14 clubs, isn't it a different answer?
Yeah, that it's different when you start a round, and for lack of a term, those are kind of considered your clubs.
Ken?
And I think that was the reason. I don't remember.
Starting the round, this might be the dumbest question you'll hear all day. Starting the round is when you make a stroke off the tee.
Yes, and we're going to find out. We're going to find out under the next rule. That's right. Yeah,
This
Ken?
rule was written for players who start around in a golf cart. Now, I show up on the first tee with 15 clubs in my bag, and I have a caddy, or I'm carrying my own bag. And I realize that I have too many clubs, and I want to take a club out and declare that I'm not, but I don't want to leave it on the first tee.
Right.
What are my options?
Well, that's what parent 2 before the round is all about. You have to declare it out of play,
I understand.
but then you can put it in your golf
A
bag.
driver?
Yes.
Oh, I can leave the driver in my bag with the head, with the,
You have to take it out of play using the procedure in sub 1 that we just went over, which means you must either declare this to the opponent or take some other clear action, such as turning it upside down.
okay.
So that's
So in
That's-
stroke play, I would announce to my marker or my fellow competitors that I'm not using the Titleist driver, I'm using,
Yes, and to be clear, you would say, and I'm specifically declaring the Titleist driver out of play, because then you've now complied with the procedure of sub C. All right.
Dan, we have a quick question from Charles online. He's wondering if a training aid such as an orange whip is considered as a club and to be a part of the allowable 14.
It is not, neither is a, neither is a, neither is an alignment rod.
It's a training.
It's a training aid. And we'll get to that later on about whether you can actually use it, but there's no prohibition about carrying it, and it's not a quote conforming club. It's not a non-conforming club because it's not a club. All right, 4.2, balls. Short rule. 4.2a, balls allowed in play of round. In making each stroke, a player must use a ball that conforms to the requirements of the equipment rule. A player may get a conforming ball from anyone on the course. So you can borrow a ball from anyone, unlike clubs, which you cannot borrow from anyone. And the conforming ball, you're only going to get a penalty if you make a stroke with a non-conforming ball that counts in your score. So you're on the tee, you hit one what you think is out of bounds, you go to your bag, you get another ball, you tee it up, and you hit it right down the middle, and that ball that you just hit is a non-conforming ball. If you find your original ball in bounds and on the course, you get no penalty. If you don't find it, you're disqualified. Deliberately altering a ball must not be played, such as scuffing it or heating it. There's also no procedure to undo the scuffing or undo the heating. So if you heat it up and you then wait for it to get the room temperature, seems to me you can't use it because it's been deliberately altered.
By the way, it's proven fact that heating the ball does not change the characteristics of it.
And Gary Wild has just informed us that heating a ball does not change the characteristics.
Really?
Yeah, should I send you the information?
They actually mentioned that at the roof.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Because I remember the test center used to have this display. Or maybe that was just about wind, maybe it wasn't temperature.
Wind, definitely.
So a ball that's 20 degrees, that's been sitting out in the car will go just as far as a ball that's 80 degrees.
Yep, it conforms real quickly to the temperature from the time that you try heating it up in your pocket with whatever or in your bag. Yep.
For those online, we've just had an intellectual discussion about what heating a ball does, whether it does or does not improve. Whether it does or does not improve, you cannot do it. All right, let's move on to 4.2b. Ball breaks into pieces while playing a hole. The ball breaks into pieces after a stroke. There is no penalty, and the stroke does not count. Notice that it does not say the stroke is canceled. It says the stroke does not count. This was one of the nice changes in the new rules, is elimination of the word cancellation when it is really a, quote, automatic cancellation. Under the old rules, if it was a match play situation, there were certain times when you could cancel a stroke, such as the ball being played from outside the teeing area. Under the old rules, you also could cancel a stroke if it was automatically canceled in certain circumstances, such as you're on the putting green and you hit an animal when you putt, or such as the ball breaking into pieces. Under the new rules, the correct term is now the stroke does not count, and that takes the place of the old term automatic cancellation. 4.2C, ball becomes cut or cracked while playing hole. This is another nice change in the rules. They have headings and titles to sections and subsections that sort of clearly tell you what is going on in that rule. So notice that it says ball becomes cut or cracked while playing hole. The old term was unfit for play. And then you had to look up a definition and figure out what unfit for play was. Now it's saying a ball becomes cut or cracked while playing a hole. So that's all this rule is talking about, is a ball that's cut or cracked. So, parent 1, lifting ball to see if it's cut or cracked. If a player reasonably believes that his or her ball has been cut or cracked while playing a hole, the player may lift the ball to look at it, but the spot of the ball must first be marked, and the ball must not be cleaned except on the putting green. Notice what is not in this requirement is the requirement to announce and let your fellow competitor or opponent observe. You don't have to do this anymore. This is one of the changes, and the theory is it's to conform with the other relief rules where you're not required to announce to anybody else what you're doing. So if your ball is on a cart path, historically you did not need to announce, and you still don't, that you're taking relief. It may be good practice to do so, but you don't have to. This new rule is saying, 4.2C, that if you were going to pick it up to see if it's cut or cracked, you do not have to announce.
Do you still have to hold, this used to hold true, maybe it doesn't hold true anymore, but where you have to pick the ball up and put it back down exactly the way it was? Let's say you've got some mud on the ball, and because you want to put it down differently, you can't do that, can you? You have to, or is that no longer the case where you have to pick your ball up and put it down exactly the way the ball was when you picked it up?
The short answer is that you must replace the ball. And we're going to see that in a minute. The longer answer is later on in this presentation, in fact, I think John's covering Rule 14, he's going to talk about replacing a ball. The slightly shorter answer than the real long answer is you cannot set it directly on the mud if it was on the mud before, because you have not put it back in the correct place, because place requires a vertical, one of the components is the vertical component. So if that throws you off, wait until Rule 14, and John will explain that in greater detail. So Bob's quite excited for the presentation. Yeah, John.
Does that now mean that you cannot clean it in any fashion to determine whether it's cracked? Because it says it must not be cleaned.
You have to be able, well, that's a good question. If there is a spot of mud and you think that there is a cut underneath it, this rule is saying that you cannot clean it. And we're going to see when we get to the next page when you can substitute. And that's, I think, will answer your question, John.
But substituting has nothing to do with cleaning.
Yeah. Hold that question for 1 second until we get to the next page. There are two other times in the rules in which the announcement and the let observe has gone away. This is bonus time. Anybody know the other two?
ID.
Yes. Rule 7.3, when you are trying to identify the ball. And what's the other one? When you're lifting ball to see if it lies in the condition where relief is allowed, that's 16.4. All right, so let's go on to the next page, parent 2, and hopefully this will answer John's question. The player may only substitute another ball if it can be clearly seen that the original ball is cut or cracked. So I am playing a match against John. I'm on the 14th hole at Erin Hills. I hit it up to the putting green. I look down. I see my ball is cracked. I pick it up. I throw it as far as I can into the penalty area at the bottom of 14. And I substitute a ball. Any penalty on me for doing that? No. Why? Because it can be clearly seen that the original ball is cut or cracked. So now let's talk about John's question. John picks up his ball because he thinks it may be cut or cracked. He cannot clearly see that it is cut or cracked, but there is a huge spot of mud, and he has a sneaking suspicion that underneath that mud is a cut or a crack. Can you clean it off to determine whether it's cut or cracked? My reading of the rule would say, no, you cannot. John, do you disagree?
No, I
John Morrissey?
I agree, and that's not a change. That's the way it was before as well.
Well, how about the question that you get up to the green, you take a look at it, you throw it in the water. You can't be reviewed anymore.
Right.
Don't you have some responsibility to your fellow competitors? I mean, anybody could go up, maybe he hits a cart path, gets a little scratched, get up there and just throw it away. And
Well, I guess one way to look at it, Tim.
well, you see these pros on the tour, my God, when they think their ball has a slightest little blemish on it, they have kind of a heart attack. And this would just kind of eliminate that.
Yeah, well,
Just throw the damn thing in the water.
You're right, but it doesn't happen much. Balls are cut or cracked. But it's a little bit like, let's say you and I are playing, I'm way off in the rough, and you see me lift a ball and drop it. You're like, what the hell are you doing? And I said, oh, well, there's some temporary water, puddle of temporary water over here. What are you gonna do? You're gonna take my word for it, right? And what if you say, oh, I don't believe it, I want to come see it, and there is it there, but you don't know for sure if I was close enough to have interference.
And remember, player integrity is the hallmark of the rules. The player has the,
Playing by the rules.
Well, things you read on the, about the tour players, getting all upset, and one guy says, that ball isn't cracked, and now you got an argument.
well,
That's what I guess that's what makes me suspicious. That,
if there's an argument and you still have the ball, then that's why you call the referee over. But the rule does not require anyone else to see it. It says if it can be clearly seen that the original ball is cut or cracked.
I would also argue that even under the old rule where you had to bring in an opponent and match player, fellow competitor, rarely would they go over and actually look to see if the ball was cut, cracked, or out of shape. They would just go, okay, do whatever.
yeah, so that guy will say the same thing back to you.
All right, so what happens if you pick the ball up? You then have to put the original, if the original ball is cut or cracked, the player must replace either another ball or the original ball on the spot, and it has a reference to 14.2. We're going to see when we get to 14.2 that the reference to 14.2 is the reference to replace the ball. Sometimes you will see and that you must play it, and you'll see a reference to 14.6. When you see a reference to 14.6, that means that you have to play the stroke from where the previous stroke was made. And the difference is probably going to be whether you're going to have to drop the ball or whether you're going to replace it. All right, any questions on balls? 4.3, equipment or use of equipment. And again, the title of the rule is very helpful to figure out what is in the rule. It doesn't say equipment, it says use of equipment. This rule only covers how equipment is used. It does not limit the equipment that a player may have with him or her during a round. 4.3a. A player may use equipment to help his or her play during a round, except that the player must not create a potential advantage by. So in other words, the structure of this is you can use any equipment you want, except you can't use one that creates a potential advantage in one of these two ways. Bullet point number 1, using equipment other than a club or a ball that artificially eliminates or reduces the need for skill or judgment that is essential to the game. We'll go over some of those. Or uses equipment, including a club or a ball, in an abnormal way in making a stroke. And notice the word "in making a stroke." So an example of that, under the old rules, there was a couple of rules decisions. The person is on the putting green, he puts a ball against the handle of his putter to grip, and he makes a couple of practice strokes. Any penalty? No. Why? Because he has not made a stroke that counts in the player's score. The next rule decision said, under the old rules, however, if he uses that ball to make against the club head to then make the stroke that counts in the score, the player is going to get the penalty. And that's what this is saying, using equipment in an abnormal way in making a stroke. All right, so we're going to go through these 6, and I can tell you that these have been changed numerous times from when the rules were originally given to the public in March of 2017. And I think this has been the hardest for the drafter of the rules to come to agreement on what to do. This rule does not affect the application of any other rule that limit actions a player is allowed to take with the club, such as setting down a club or other object to help line up. And there's a reference to Rule 10. We're going to see under Rule 10 that you can't place a club down when you're taking a stance. All right, so common examples. And this is the use of equipment. It looks number 1, distance and directional information. This is a change in the rules. They've changed the default provision to specifically allow a distance measuring device at any time. And you'll see that the blue language 3 or 4 lines down, the committee may adopt a local rule prohibiting the use of distance measuring devices. This rule is a very good change, but it will have no effect at all on any tournament that's played anywhere, because if you wanted to allow it, you would then write a local rule that says you can allow it. If you were on the PGA Tour, LPGA Tour, maybe Elite Amateurs, they wouldn't allow distance measuring. The problem with the old rule is it could be a trap for committees who were not as careful as Bill and Jeff are, and they don't put it on their hard card, and they could run into situations where the rules prohibit it. Now, we've turned it 180 degrees so that distance measuring devices are allowed unless a local rule prohibits it. Not allowed. Measuring elevation changes, so-called slope. The couple of rules decisions under the old rules were that you could plumb line with your club by holding it up, but you could not plumb line by holding a weight with a string with the weight at the end, or you couldn't put a soda bottle or a bottle of water on the putting green to see which way it slopes. Those are still part of the, those have effectively been adopted with this language that you cannot measure elevation changes. And of course, you can't use the equipment, the distance measuring device that has a slope feature that says it's 157 to the hole, but it's playing 164 because of the elevation.
Unless you write it in your yardage book.
Well,
Exactly what that, from what it is to the middle of the green.
yes, Gary makes a good point about the distinction between using equipment to get to the result and using your skill, knowledge, and so forth to get to that result. You could go on a practice round, shoot the pin at 157, look at your slope and say it's 167. So I know that this is an uphill of 10 degrees. Then when you get to the course, you then measure where the pin is. If it's 150, you say, okay, I'm gonna add 10 yards. Notice that you have not used equipment during the round to do that. You have just used your own judgment and skill based on your knowledge of how golf is played and so forth. All right. Number 2, information on wind and other weather information. So you can use equipment to measure and get information on wind and weather conditions. So you open up your iPhone when you get to the course and it says it's 72 degrees, the wind is northwest, it's 5 miles an hour, the dew point is 28, blah, blah, blah. You can do all of that stuff at the course and you can measure that with an iPhone. Or
During the
smart-
round?
Yes. And interestingly enough, when you get to the course, you can actually take out a thermometer if you don't believe your iPhone, and you can hold it up and say, ah, yes, it is 72 degrees.
No, we don't care because.
The ball.
Yeah.
Who cares? Temperature. There you go.
And what are you not allowed to do? You cannot measure wind speed. What that means is you can hold up your iPhone and you can look and it says the wind speed is 15 miles an hour. What you can't do is that you can't take a little handheld device or other device, hold it up that blows the wind through it, and then say, oh, it's 15 degrees. It may be a distinction without a difference, but you are permitted to look at weather conditions and weather reports.
Say that again. You can use the iPhone to get the same information that you can't use older technology to get the.
Your iPhone.
No.
Well, but
The iPhone
the
is
iPhone may be
measuring,
given to you from the airport, which is 15 miles away or
Right.
30 miles away, as opposed to at the course.
That's right.
One is
And you can,
reporting, one is measuring.
Right.
We can report, not measure. Well, with regard to temperature,
Right.
humidity.
Right. Also on number 2, not allowed, and that is using an artificial object to get other wind-related information, such as using powder to assess wind direction. So the player is in the middle of the fairway, he wants to know which way the wind blows, he picks up some grass and he throws it up and it shows that it's going from left to right. Is that permissible? Yes. Instead, he gets a little powder and he throws it up. That's not permissible, and he's going to get a penalty for that. The difference between is one is artificial and one is non-artificial. Can you throw sand? Is sand an artificial object? I would say no, it is not an artificial object. So you take a handkerchief out of your pocket to test the wind. Can you do that? Is a handkerchief an artificial object? Yes. Are you doing it to get other wind-related information? Yes. Therefore, you can't do that.
If the out of bounds marker, the chalk, say it's chalk, and there's a clump of it, and you go to the white out of bounds marker, pick that up and throw it up to see.
I would read the word artificial object to mean that chalk is, at one time it's in a natural state, but it's like there's a loose impediments and a movable obstruction that once you go through the construction process of making them no longer natural, they are now artificial. So I would say chalk is an artificial device. It's no different than throwing up powder to assist.
So if I put talcum on my hands and then clap my hands, am I in violation?
It says using artificial object to get other wind-related information. So I would say it is a penalty if in fact you're doing it for the purpose of seeing which way the wind goes. If you're not doing it for that purpose, there is no penalty.
That's exactly how it was explained.
You'll all be pleased to know Bill Linneman agrees with that. Right?
No, I'm just
So
saying,
that's exactly how I was explaining class.
is that it depends on how you are
Yeah,
using.
okay. Three, thank you. information gathered before and during the round. The way to think of this is the predicate here is the use of information, the use of equipment for information gathered before or between the rounds. And basically what 3 is saying under the allowed is you can gather any information you want in any manner before the round, and then you can use that information during the round, and you can gather any information during the round, as long as you don't use it during the round, and you can use it after the round for analysis. What you can't do, and this is what we're going to talk about is on the top of the next page, is you can't both gather it and use it during the same round. So you couldn't, for instance, use an app on a phone that allows you to enter, I don't know, how far you are for each shot, what stroke you use, the humidity, and then when you get to the 9th hole, you push it, and you say, I'm 150 yards out, and it says, oh, now you use the 8-iron, not the 7-iron. That's the equipment that you can't use, that is prohibited by the parent 3. Also, it says using physiological information, for instance, blood pressure, pulse, that sort of stuff. You can't use equipment that measures it during the round and then uses it during that round. Can you use your finger to check your pulse? Yes, because your finger is not equipment. 4, audio and visual allowed. You can listen to audio or watch video on matters unrelated to the competition. That makes sense. Here's where it gets a little troublesome, such as a news report, which is fine, or background music. When we get to the not allowed, it says, listen to music or other audio to eliminate distractions to help with the swing tempo. Why is the person listening to background music? If he's listening it to get, to eliminate distractions or help with swing tempo, you can't do it. If he's using it just to listen to background music, I guess he can. How are you going to know the difference? I don't know. Bill, how are we going to know the difference?
Ask, and honestly, we have 2 or 3 players that play in our senior tour events that bring the wireless speakers, and I would never worry about any of them listening to music. But I'm glad they're now allowed, because there are a fair amount of people that do this. And I've always held that if it bothers one person, whether it be in your group or on the course, it's being turned at least down, it's not off. But it's, for this generation, it's probably unacceptable. But to the younger crowd, it's as common as you can't even imagine.
Are you saying we're old?
Earbuds covered someplace else. More mature.
No, this would be covered here. The question was, are earbuds covered anywhere else? And I said, no, they're covered by this rule. It's the same thing. If you're using earbuds that have music to help eliminate distraction or work with swing tempo, you can't use them.
We were told that earbuds can never be used because they do eliminate distractions. Is that how you would see it?
They said that at the workshop?
No.
Really?
No comment.
Well, but if you're using the earbuds
I was
for
shocked.
background music, it seems to me it's expressly permitted. It doesn't say background music only through the normal airways. That's how I would look at it. But
Yeah, that's interesting.
and there is no, as of yet, there is no interpretation on this that deals with this issue. The other thing that's not allowed under 4 is viewing video showing play of a player or other players during the competition that helps the player in choosing a club. So what you can't do is that you can't go to 12 at Augusta, pull out your iPhone, listen to Jim Nance say that when Rory McIlroy was on this hole, he used his 7-iron. You're prohibited from doing that. However, if there is a large screen TV sitting up there and it is being shown to the spectators on the course, you are permitted to watch it. So you get to the 12th and you see, oh, they're talking about Rory and what he hit. And so you listen, and he used his 7-iron, and Jim Nance says that he was short and he had wished he had used his 6. So then you decide that, well, maybe you're going to use your 6. That is permitted, and the reason is because there's no way to effectively not allow it, because otherwise you would tell a player when he gets to the 12th hole that you can't watch the screen or you can't hear anything. How do you make a stroke with your fingers in your ear and your eyes closed? So that's the reason for this. Gloves and gripping agents. This was under the old rules. There's not much change there. You can use plain gloves. You can use resin powder, and you can wrap a handkerchief. So you can't use the handkerchief to check for wind, but you can do it for gripping purposes. And you can't use gloves that I haven't seen them, but if a glove has a little groove on it where you put your fingers, that would not be a plain glove, but your standard golf gloves are permitted. All right, the last one is 6, stretching devices and training or swing aids. This is admittedly a little confusing on the way it is written. Here's how you need to think about this. It is not that you can't use an alignment rod. It's not that you can't use a weighted donut. It's the reason that you're using those pieces of equipment. So if you look at the not allowed, it says using any type of training aid or swing aid, and then if you just skip down, that creates a potential advantage by helping the player in preparing for and making a stroke, such as swing, plane, grip, alignment, ball position. So what that is saying is you can take out an alignment rod under bullet point number 1 and use it to stretch with. You can take out a donut. Instead of putting it on your club for a swing aid, you can take it and you can stretch with it. Those are permitted, but you cannot put the donut over a club and then make a swing, nor can you take the alignment rod and put it under your arms for purposes of checking your swing plane or your alignment. Similarly, you can't use a non-conforming club to make a practice swing that creates a potential advantage to help the player in making a stroke. What does that mean? That means basically you can't use something like a medicus if you're doing it to swing with, because that would be a potential advantage in helping the player make a stroke. It helps to smooth out the swing. You could take the medicus out, put it behind your shoulders, and stretch with it. And since we're on this topic of alignment aids, this is my wonderful story of the day. The first time I was ever a rules official, Bill Linneman asked me to show up at the women's public links course, public links tournament at Washington County. And on the 15th hole, one of the top women in the state missed a putt on the 14th hole. She took the alignment rod out when she got to the 15th tee, put it under her arms to simulate a swing to try and line it up. Jason Lee and I were there, and we both looked at each other, and we both said, you know, 14-3/10.3 of the old decision seemed to prohibit this. So we called Bill, and Bill said, well, yeah, it could be, but you know, she was the top player in the tournament and so forth. So We told her that it could be a potential penalty, but we would decide after the round. We then finished the round, and as fortune would have it or not have it, there were 2 qualifying spots, and she was tied for the last qualifying spot. So we had a playoff, and as fortune would have it, she won the playoff. So now she's in the tournament unless she's disqualified. So Bill called us in, and we looked at the rule, and the old 14.3, 10.3 seemed to be pretty clear that if you use an alignment rod in that matter, you're disqualified. Bill said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk to the smartest rules guy at the USGA, and if he says you're disqualified, you're disqualified. And I said to Bill, basically, well, Bill, the rule says what it says. Yeah, but if this guy says it says that, then that's something. And I said, okay, who is this guy? And Bill said, his name's John Morissette. And that was the first time I'd ever heard the name John Morissette. And I was pleased to find out that John could read the English language and confirmed for Bill and I that, yes, this young lady was disqualified because she used an alignment rod for purpose of a swing plane. And that's still the rule under the new rules, is that you could not use that alignment rod to put under your armpits to simulate a stroke, because it's helping with the stroke in the plane, but you can use it to stretch. Gary.
I brought this up once before, but it still would be permissible to use the alignment rod, which is shorter than the driver in my golf bag, to measure for a drop so you don't get the club grips wet and dirty.
Yeah, there's no,
It would not matter.
the equipment rule is, again, you have to keep in mind that it is to create a potential advantage by helping with the swing. And this is not, if you use an alignment rod in that fashion, it would not do that.
To your point, the length of the club or club length is the longest club in your bag except for a putter. So you can use whatever you want, but the club length is the longest club in your bag except for a putter. Period. Is that how you see it, John?
Yeah, the way I look at it is, the club length it's a certain measurement. In your bag, it might be 44.25 inches. So whatever you use to measure 44.25 inches is okay.
You don't have to use anything.
Right. You just have to get it in the right
Yeah.
place.
Yes, when you have to drop within a club length, other than the putter, that just means that you must drop, as John said, within 43.6 inches. And however you get it there, you get it there. If you don't get it there, you don't get it there. All right, a couple more things. Equipment used for medical reasons. Player's not in breach if he has a medical reason to use the equipment and the committee decides that it does not give the player an unfair advantage. So PGA Tour wraps tape around his finger. Is that permissible? And the answer is it depends on why he wraps it around his finger. If he wraps it around his finger for a medical reason, to prevent blisters, maybe you already have one there so it doesn't get worse, you're okay. But you can't do it if you're doing it to help you grip the club better, more strongly, or whatever. The other thing that's interesting about tape, and this is sub 2, the player may use adhesive tape or similar covering for any medical reason, but the tape or covering must not, A, be applied excessively or help the player more than necessary for medical reasons, i.e. you can't mobilize a joint. One of the interesting things, and you see this a lot on the LPGA Tour, is the use of the Kinesius, I think that's what it's called, Kinesius tape. And you can decide for yourself whether you think it's applied excessively or not, but there are some players that use a good deal of it. And I've even seen some that go actually over the elbow. In other words, you take it from the shoulder, you take it down over the elbow, almost up to the wrist. Well, if it's done for immobilizing a joint, you can't do it. If it's there for muscle control and a medical issue, then I guess you can. And the beauty of all of the equipment stuff is no one in this room other than Bill and Jeff have to worry about it Because at the end of the day, it's their call, not ours, right, Bill?
No, I would say, and we would make that call jointly. We would all have a say in the matter at least.
All right, let's talk about the penalty for 4.3. And this is significant because this comes up throughout the rules. Penalty for breach of 4.3. Penalty for first breach from single act or related acts, general penalty. Penalty for second breach unrelated to first breach, disqualification. I want to go through a couple of examples, but the concern I have with the way this is written is the word related is used in two different contexts. It's used to modify the word acts in the first, and then it's used to modify breach in the second. Let me give you some examples. Player, a penalty for first breach from a single act. Person is on in the middle of the fairway, they're waiting to play their shot, they take out an alignment rod, they put it under their shoulders to swing. Well, that's the first breach. And then the player goes back to their bag, they put it back, they say, I guess I better go do that again. And so they go and they do it again. That is no longer a single act, but it's a related act because it's the same thing. The reason that it moves into the disqualification penalty is if you have an intervening event or the acts themselves are not related. Give an example. So the person uses the swing aid, the alignment rod under their arms. They then make a stroke. They use it again. There's been an intervening event, and the intervening event is the stroke. They're disqualified. If the person uses an alignment rod under their arms and then decides, since they got nothing better to do, they pull out their wind gauge to measure the wind at the course, they have now committed a second breach that is unrelated to the first. Even though there hasn't been an intervening event, the player is going to be disqualified because those acts were unrelated. And the last sentence of 4 says, this penalty applies even if the nature of the breach was entirely different than the breach resulting in the first breach, or first penalty. So the way this is not the way it's written, but the way I remember what this difference is, when you read the words penalty for first breach from single act or related act, I then add the phrase, provided there is no intervening event. When you read the second penalty section, it says penalty for second breach unrelated to first breach, I would then add either because it's an unrelated act or it was a related act separated by an intervening event. So what kicks it into the disqualification is the acts themselves are unrelated, or there's been an intervening event between the first time and the second time.
Would putting it in the bag and then taking it out and doing it again?
Intervening event, there's an interpretation under Rule 1.3. It's worth looking at. I think it's 1.3C4/1 that says an intervening event is making a stroke, putting a ball into play, or becoming aware that it's a potential breach. So if someone puts a donut on and makes a swing, and then the other person says, well, I don't think you can do that, and the person says, well, I think I can, and they do it a second time, they're disqualified because there was an intervening event.
It could be also something like measuring slope with a rangefinder and then listening to background music or something.
Right. In that case, those are unrelated. So even if there's no intervening event, you're going to be disqualified.
So
Yeah,
I
Jim?
use the rod to try to get me lined up to hit it down the fairway. I use the rod, then I hit, and I hit it 30 degrees off to the right, and I pull it back out to try to see how I didn't get myself lined up properly to hit it down the fairway. But I'm using it the second time simply because I obviously didn't get lined up the first time when I took it out to try to get it.
My advice would be to use a club rather than the alignment rod. But I think the answer is you're disqualified because that you have used it both times to create a potential advantage by preparing for or making a stroke, such as helping with swing plane, grip, alignment, and that's really what you're talking about is alignment.
Yeah, the alignment.
And so you've done it
the next
twice,
stroke down
and
low.
there's an intervening event. Scary.
Have you seen this new alignment thing that the tee goes into? And it's probably 3 inches long max, 2.5. Your tee goes right in the middle of it. It points the direction this way. I just saw it advertised this weekend. And you put your ball on your tee, and it's a form of an alignment. I just want to let you know that it's out
Sounds
there.
like a non-conforming.
Yes.
I'm sure it's non-conforming.
Right.
But just to let you know, there's going to be people in some of our events that come up with this. And some of our guys that play in the events might.
All right, so the question is, when is the player disqualified? Or when does the player get a penalty? Only when he makes a stroke. You're permitted to carry it because it's a piece of non-conforming equipment, and you haven't made a stroke with it, so you're okay. If you make a stroke, and that stroke counts in the score, so the player better hope that it's match play, and he's used it, and his opponent recalls the stroke.
So the question is, stroke play tournament, one of our rules officials are in the group with him. Does he say something before he hits or attempts to hit, or does he not? That's a rhetorical question.
Yeah, I hope it is, because we talked about that in the past. If a player is about to tee off in front of the tee marker, you as a rules official out there, you would say something like, excuse me, sir,
Would you like to take a look at
so
this?
you're a little bit behind the head of the tee marker.
Jim, you wanted to use that, didn't you? Too bad.
I don't have an alignment rod, but I do play with a guy who has an alignment rod who uses it a lot on the practice tee. And I'm wondering, what the hell is he doing?
Any other questions or concern before we tell Jeff to sign us off?